Tucker Carlson just concluded a 90-minute diatribe on what he believes the future of America should be. A lot of people were anticipating that this might be an announcement of some sort, and there was no announcement forthcoming. Although at the very, very last moment, Tucker did give a slight grin to camera and say that he was going to be making major announcements at some point in the future. The rest of the night really was uh, Tucker telling us 10 things that he thinks would make the country a better place. I think all 10 of them at surface level, were unobjectionable, but the devil's in the details. And as Tucker continued on each one of the points, the details became worse and worse from a conservative point of view. I've been saying for the last year that Tucker has a political project and that project is to create a new American majority out of a coalition formed from left-wing economic populists and right-wing social populists. I think tonight's speech by Tucker really doubles down on that view. He clearly is engaged in trying to reshape the country. He didn't launch a third party tonight, but he alluded to a future third party, and maybe even a fourth party, he said. He seems to believe that the system that we currently have, the post-war consensus as he refers to it, has failed Americans entirely. And the picture that he paints for the state of our country is particularly bleak. I don't think anyone would disagree with some of the broad criticisms that Tucker had for modern culture. But there is a lot to disagree with him about in the particular, and also a lot to disagree with him about in terms of the emphasis. What I mean by that is that while beauty, which is one of the things that Tucker says that the country needs, is in fact important, and while in certain very real ways America has become less beautiful and the West has become less beautiful, I'm not sure that it's one of the most important problems facing the country. I'm not sure that there's a vast conspiracy behind it to break the souls of mankind and keep us in states of despair and gloom. It strikes me that it's far more likely that it's a product of a culture that's overly focused on efficiency, a culture that's been growing until very, very recently and needed to have architecture that could be thrown up much more quickly because of the incredible abundance that was being created by our system. And in some ways, architecturally in particular, it's because America uniquely stopped thinking about what buildings look like on the outside and prioritized instead what they felt like to work in on the inside. When you visit the beautiful Victorian architecture in Europe and some of the original office buildings from the beginning of industrialization, they are in fact quite awe-inspiring when you're looking at them from across the street in a park. But if you think about what it would have been like to work inside them, and never mind the fact that they had no air conditioning and still don't, you also deal with the fact that they have no sunlight. Whereas the American offices that were created in the second part of the 20th century were sort of premised on the idea that everyone working inside needed to have access to light, that there needed to be broad open spaces. Now, we might say that that's the wrong emphasis. We might say that people made a mistake in some of those calculations. But to hear Tucker tell it, this was all part of some sort of scheme to break the soul of the West. And so, too, a sort of conspiratorial bent runs through all of the various points that Tucker made throughout the evening. In his emphasis, in his particulars, he paints a very bleak picture indeed for where we are as a people. And while he does purport to be offering a kind of path forward, it's unclear how that path forward actually comes into existence. And it's unclear to me that that path forward results in a freer, more prosperous, and more virtuous people. It seems to me that it only results in a centralized authority where a very select group of people, friends of Tucker Carlson's, the kind of people who go over to his house and take photographs together, might be in charge of deciding what exactly is in the interests of every one of us, whether we agree with him or not. Is Tucker running for president? I've never known the answer to that, and I still don't. Is he launching a third party? He certainly seems to be. And many of the people who were at the meeting last week, in which apparently this third party was the topic, today spent their time saying that Tucker not only should be the leader of that party, but should be the leader of the country. Now, it's very early. For people who thought that Tucker might announce a presidential run tonight, J.D. Vance hasn't even announced for the presidency in 2028 and probably won't do so for 9 more months. It's not in the interest of the incumbent vice president to announce in January, for example. He wants to keep people guessing for as long as possible to try to keep people out of the field as they wait to figure out what he's going to do. So, of course, Tucker was very unlikely 18 months out from the presidential election or 16 months out from the presidential election to announce for the presidency. But he is certainly about a political project. Can a third party succeed in America? No, of course it can't. People who say that we should have 3 parties or we should have 4 parties are calling for a sort of European, they probably don't know what they're calling for, but they're calling for a sort of European-style parliamentary system. Those are not better historically than ours at preserving individual liberty. The proof is in the pudding. We're still the freest country in the world, and most of the free countries of Europe are far less free than we. And our two-party system isn't accidental. It actually has a really moderating effect. I know there's this idea, and Tucker always puts this idea forward, that we have one sort of super party in this country, that the two parties don't disagree. In fact, he said tonight that all of their disagreements are manufactured to keep you thinking that you actually have choices, when in fact you don't, because they agree on every major issue and they don't really disagree about anything. Tell that, of course, to the various people like Donald Trump or Charlie Kirk, who were shot by members of the opposition political movement in this country. Tell it to Donald Trump, who had his house raided down at Mar-a-Lago by the party that was in power, the Democrat Party, while he was a former president in that little period where that was true. Of course, there are two parties, and of course, they have very different ideas, but they do moderate one another, because one of the nice things about a two-party system is it forces every idea into one of the two buckets, which means that some of the worst ideas, they don't always fail to gain traction, but they often fail to gain traction. That's actually a protection that we have from our two-party system, but it opens up the two-party system to just this sort of complaint, that because it moderates some of the most extreme voices over time in either one of the various parties, that somehow that means that it's really a consensus, it's really a one-party state, when nothing could be further from the truth. But all of that is intended to make you feel despair. It's intended to make you manageable. It's intended to make you have revolutionary ideas. It's intended to make you tear down the system that is, or at least to support people who promise to tear down the system that is in favor of this new system that they promise will make things more fair, more equitable, more beautiful, that will somehow restore sovereignty, although it was very unclear to me what Tucker meant by that. He said very little about liberty. He said very little about security. In fact, he seems to say that all talk of security is just a way of keeping you in the clutches of warmongers who are profiting off of murder, and that is the word that he used, all around the world. Only one time has a third party worked in the country. We're going to get into that. It's the formation of the Republican Party, and it was a very unique set of circumstances. But what a third party might, while it might fail to elect a president, it could very well succeed in continuing to sow division and chaos on the right, and I think that's the entire point. There are foreign interests who want exactly that, of course, and Tucker, whether wittingly or unwittingly, is doing their work for them. Last week, Tucker Carlson sat down on his show with a woman who has been publicly accused of working for Russian intelligence. When Tucker brought up the accusation with her, she of course denied it. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is Tucker's reaction. He said, quote, "I just want to say out loud, I don't care." He doesn't care if one of his guests is actually an asset for a hostile foreign government. Then he gave her nearly 2 hours of unopposed airtime. Her name, at least on his show, is Elizabeth Lane. She's from the country of Georgia, and she's an open admirer of Vladimir Putin. In 2022, she called America the cancer of the world. The Insider reports that her real name is Iza Bendianishvili. That is probably not how you pronounce that, but it's the closest that you're ever going to get from me. They also say that her romantic partner was an officer in Russia's FSB. From 1998 to 2004, he kept a registered address, according to the Insider, at a Moscow apartment block that also housed 2 FSB assassins tied to the 2024 murder of a Russian opposition leader. There's nothing wrong, of course, with interviewing people with whom you disagree. There's nothing wrong with interviewing very, very bad people. In fact, interrogating bad people is an important act of journalism. But giving them 2 hours of unopposed airtime, which is what Tucker did, is an act of propaganda. Which brings us to Aleksandr Dugin. Dugin has been under American sanctions since 2015 for the role that he played in recruiting fighters for one of Russia's wars. And on the last day of 2024, the Treasury Department sanctioned an organization that Dugin founded for running Russia-funded AI disinformation aimed directly at American voters, an actual Russian op aimed at targeting American voters. In April of 2024, in Moscow, Dugin sat down with Tucker Carlson and did his show, where he told Tucker's audience that wokeness, transgenderism, the assault on the family, and the entire transhumanist project are all consequences of American individualism and, of course, the Protestant Reformation. Tucker's response, quote, "What you're describing is clearly happening, and it's horrifying." Dugin is manipulating Americans by leveraging a real pain point on the right, the rise of radical leftism. He's doing it to discredit the American inheritance itself. And what he's offering isn't some sort of return to Christianity. It's actually older than Christianity. It's paganism and it's Gnosticism dressed up as political theory, the sacred state, the nation as its own God, the collective sovereign over the soul. Dugin has been explicit about his objective, which is, quote, the destruction of the American empire. What he offers in its place is something he calls multipolarity, which is just America sharing global power with other interests like China and Russia. But here's the thing, it's a scam. It's always been a scam. Power is not shared between superpowers, at least not for long. Somebody always ends up in charge. And if it isn't America, well, then Americans will become subservient to whoever it is. And whoever it is won't share our values. It means our children won't inherit what we believe. Our children will inherit what those powers believe. That's atheist values, Chinese values, the values of men who poison journalists somewhere over in Moscow, not ours. And while the right splinters, Democrats just nominated a Bernie Sanders protege named Abdul El Said as their Senate nominee in Michigan and an open Democratic socialist in that state's 7th congressional district. The socialist left is absolutely ascendant right now, and a divided right is in no shape to oppose them, which isn't just bad for Republicans, it's bad for Americans. The question tonight, who are the influencers, domestic and foreign, behind this political project? What do they want, and who can we trust right now, if anyone? Here to work through it, James Lindsay, mathematician, co-author of The Cynical Theories, and founder of New Discourses, returning to the show for a second time. We tried to find literally anyone else, but everybody told us no. Also, J. Michael Waller, author and president of Georgetown Research, an expert in Russian psyops who learned it straight from the source, a Soviet defector, and they put his name in the teleprompter. I've already tried to read one Eastern European name. I ain't trying to read the second one. But he ran ops for the Soviets against the West, and so we're going to hear what he taught. And Ryan Mauro, senior fellow for counter-extremism at the Capital Research Center, who investigated Elizabeth Lane and whom she, in response, accused of working for the CIA and Mossad. And I think she actually just posted on Twitter just before we started that tonight he runs to mommy and daddy. I don't know which one of us on this panel is mommy, and I don't know which one of this on this panel is daddy, but I've got dibs on daddy. I just want to put that out there right from the beginning. Ryan, it's kind of a high honor, I think, to have a Russian operative accuse you of working for Mossad.
And also the Ukrainians, the British, and NATO. And yeah, I think we counted 38 times. They mentioned my name in a negative context on that podcast over a period of 2 hours, which I'm quite proud of because it shows that they're a bit worried about what myself and my colleagues found and that we put out there about Elizabeth Lane, the name that she has taken since before coming to the United States from the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And everything you said is accurate about her contacts with Russian intelligence, including someone who fought for the Wagner Group, which the UK designates as a Russian terrorist group. The US designates it as a transnational criminal group. So these are very bad ties. But she also advocates for domestic terrorism. She says it's not domestic terrorism, it's civil disobedience, but she says I'm explicitly pro-violence. Let me explain what I mean by that. You should go to the homes of Zionist officials, force them to resign, and things like that. And that's out there. So for Tucker, and Buckley also talked to her, Tucker's brother, to have someone on that advocates a violent revolution was surprising to me, in addition to the Russian intelligence links. But then I think what we saw tonight, it really kind of made sense, actually.
Tucker is always so careful to say that he abhors violence. Obviously. He hates all violence. And yet he's platforming someone on his show. And I say platforming. They'll mock me for saying platforming because they'll say, oh, you think talking to someone is platforming? No, platforming somebody is when you give them a platform. You don't push back on them. You don't ask them difficult questions. That is platforming, of course. So he's platforming someone who's calling for violence in the country.
Right. She, throughout the interview, she kept characterizing things that were Russian influence operations as being acts of heroic valor in order to expose the West, and then the West's operations to counter those same operations as being acts of aggression. It was really interesting mirroring. But what you saw today, it was really struck me, aside from the arrogance of Tucker thinking that saying these things about what America should be beautiful and basically just be good, thinking that's such a decent, yeah, optimistic, such a momentous occasion that needed this announcement, was he thinks he's like a new founding father. I mean, notice what he said. He's talking about a rebirth. And he talked about how we hang on to things from our ancestors. And he mentioned, I believe it was the Constitution specifically. And that dovetails with things other people are saying in his orbit. It seems clear to me that he thinks he is the new genius, that the system needs to fall so that his agenda governing every part of society can be implemented. And if we don't listen to him, I mean, he said it multiple times, like, follow my opinion or you're going to get violence. The country's going to fall apart, which ironically is what his colleagues like Aleksandr Dugin are promoting. So that kind of makes sense of that association too, because he views the instability that they're pushing as a vindication for his own resentment against the United States. And he can point to it and say, America, that's why you need me. I've got it all figured out, because he's kind of stitched together all these ideas from people around him. And you can kind of trace some of those ideas, even coming from places like the Church of Scientology. There's a Russia-linked guy from the senior levels of Scientology that's connected to him. And it seems clear to me that he's basically said, I have the best people around me. I've got the best ideas. I'm aggregating them all, stitching them together, and I'm going to be responsible for the rebirth of America. He sees himself as the new George Washington. And if you don't listen to him, well, then there's going to be a violent revolution.
Yeah, I'm George Washington or else.
Yeah.
I wrote down the 10 things that Tucker called for. Again, surface level, no one would disagree with any of these. America should be fair. America should be sovereign, productive, beautiful, healthy, honest, optimistic, wise, decent, and united. There's no fact of a culture more important than the language that people speak. That was the definition, I guess, of unity. We were so far into the speech at that point that I thought, man, the fact that now English as a universal national language, I didn't know that was the biggest problem in the country. But, 7:30 it seemed to be. Why would we take the time tonight to talk about Tucker's speech when all 10 of those things are so... every one of us would agree America should be beautiful, and America should be healthy, and America should be honest, and America should be decent. Mike, what's the problem with the project?
Well, the problem is, first, nothing in it is new. Nothing in it is something that most people can disagree on. It's all pretty basic stuff. Nothing was urgent. Why the big deal? What I found really very notable is what he did not say. He never once mentioned Vladimir Putin's Russia. He never once mentioned communist China. He never once mentioned the jihadis and the money that the jihadist regimes are pouring into our country. And he never mentioned domestic subversive organizations, whether it's backed by Cuba or other regimes. Those things that are disuniting us was not an issue for Tucker Carlson tonight.
No, well, the only thing that's creating disunity in the country, the only reason we're not united, it seemed to me, is because of debt, Israel, big business and big lobby groups, and the super party, the actual powers that run the country, who agree on everything but pretend to disagree in the forms of Democrats and Republicans, and by name half of the Trump administration, including the president himself. I mean, to listen to Tucker tonight, those are all of the problems that face the country that create this lack of unity.
It's a really, he's taking points that people can agree with, and then he twists it in this weird way that you said, where it's like it's a big conspiracy theory that he's drawing, that both sides in Washington and both halves of the country are really secretly in agreement with one another, and it's all just a show.
What is Tucker's political project, James? What's he trying to advance with this? I mean, he made a big deal to tell us that he was going to have this speech tonight, set a stream time for it. Obviously, that photo last week with Joe Kent and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie was a kind of marketing for tonight. Why did he want eyeballs on this?
I mean, I agree with what Ryan said is that he is, I mean, he said the word rebirth. He has this idea that the whole speech, the whole 90 minutes, which I'm still stupefied from spending 90 minutes listening to this. The whole 90 minutes was effectively this, you know, poem, long epic poem about the decline of America and how it's due to conspiratorial forces. I heard, you know, you've mentioned Aleksandr Dugin, this weird Russian philosopher, and weird is the key word with this guy. I heard notes of him, whether it's from the autarky, whether it's from, you know, appeals to tradition or whatever. But most importantly, I think if studying Dugin kind of shows, I think the relationship to Dugin's philosophy, if not Dugin himself with Tucker, is profound enough to matter. And so what's happening on a bigger picture, Dugin uses a word in his book, The Foundations of Geopolitics, which he wrote in 97. It became important to the Russian officer corps for a while. This is a very weird book. It's very unpleasant to read, but he characterizes the Atlantic West, the sea powers that we are, as being rootless. We don't have the right values because we're not rooted in the deepness of tradition that goes from one generation to the next by being stuck landlocked, by having to solve brutal winters. No, we can trade. So, you know, we'll exchange our values at the door. We'll be more fluid about it, just like water, because, you know, if I'm an American and I sail to France, you know, while in Paris, I'm Parisian. I got to make the business deal. So I will sacrifice my values. So he's got this whole picture. And what he does is he says that there's this value system that's the continuity or the continuation of the Atlantic West that he calls mondialism, which he attributes to the French word monde, which means world. I would summarize this term for a new person to the word as one worldism, or as our democracy, actually. George Soros is a devotee of this. The World Economic Forum has been pushing this. The Democratic Party has been pushing this. And the Bush doctrine of democracy building abroad, which of course Tucker alluded to a bunch of times, is the right-wing aspect of this. We're not going to go have a big grand open society like the left, like Soros wants. We're going to go to Iraq and we're going to bust their heads until they have democracy. It's the right wing and the left wing versions. This thing that they call the neocons refers to the Bush doctrine, not to the Reagan doctrine, not to the Goldwater or the William F. Buckley. They're specifically talking about this nation building, democracy building project. Well, okay, so here's where Tucker's pointing at things that are right and where Dugin is pointing at things that are right, and I will say behind Tucker, which is that mondialism is a failed project. And the vast majority of the American conservatives have recognized that it's a failed project. President Donald Trump's rise, MAGA, and the kind of the America First movement, everything, and I mean the one that President Trump leads, not the one that Nick Fuentes leads, which are completely different. This entire project is a awakening to a rejection of a mondialist program. You could date it from World War I with the League of Nations, World War II with the United Nations, or really it kind of coming into its fullness in the late 1960s, going into the early 1970s, and it gripped both parties. Tucker's not wrong. So there's this huge MAGA opposition to this mondialist thing. Now, Dugin's hypothesis is that is being a Westerner. That is the logical conclusion of being a Westerner, is being a mondialist. And what Tucker wants to do is to take, so your question was, what's his project? He wants to take MAGA, conservative Americans, red-blooded Americanists who believe in the founding, who love President Trump, and convince them that while they hate this globalists, aka mondialist project, the way the Russians are doing it is better. They're resisting it better. Tucker's resisting it better. So abandon President Trump and get behind them, whatever his new project is going to be, because that's what's really going to resist. But what he's actually doing is pulling them out of the American project and into this new project, which is rooted in the ideas of, like I said, autarky, this idea that we can be totally self-sufficient within our own borders, which is important to have as kind of a backup plan, but is very expensive. It bankrupted the Nazis when Hitler got too hooked on it in the 1930s. Dugin's very big into this. He believes that the Asian empire, the Eurasian, empire, not continent, the Eurasian continent has the necessary resources to be completely self-sufficient. And you have that kind of where Tucker's talking about being productive, was that we're going to bring all of our kind of manufacturing back. We're going to grow all of our own food, et cetera, et cetera. And not that we couldn't, it's just that it's not necessarily the best way to go about things. So what I think anyway, I digress, what I think he's trying to do is that there are two opposing things, two opposing movements or causes, recognizing that Mondialism was a bad job, that it has, if it was ever useful, it's reached its logical conclusion and should be jettisoned, should be left behind. We can't force an open society. We can't democracy build. This is not a good deal. And there's two ways to oppose it, MAGA and whatever this multipolarist project is. And Tucker's trying to siphon MAGA people off into the other project, which is more angry, which is based in a critical theory, which, like you said in your opening, has this idea of being kind of like occultist and mystical, and the not just sovereign state, but the sacred state that can't really be questioned, that's going to look out for the common good of all the people on its terms as it sees them, rather than what our founders believed and what Trump tries to live up to, which is this idea that the common good arises from securing individuals' liberties, not to have their liberties encroached, not to lose their life, liberty, property, or pursuit of happiness without due process of law, and therefore to create a society that's filled with good because people are out there doing good things, not because the state figured out how to, as at one point Tucker said, took money away from illegal immigrants, which I would agree with, and sends checks to American citizens, which I do not agree with at all. The idea is actually to not have the government creating dependency in citizens and to unleash them to do business, et cetera.
Yeah, dependency is true slavery. When you say, let's take the money from illegal immigrants and write checks to American citizens, and it's hard to know because he didn't continue that thought in the speech. It's hard to know if he misspoke. He said it clearly, but it may not be that he clearly meant it. But yet nothing is worse than to subsidize the American people because it creates dependency between the American people and the state. It makes you true victims in a time when the victim mentality is probably the most crippling problem in the country because of critical theory at both left and right, to create further dependency. And listen, I say that Tucker, at a surface level, much of what he said tonight one could agree with. It's only in the particulars and the emphasis that the arguments start to fall apart. But he has a kind of disdain for the people bringing about the AI revolution. I'm fairly bullish on AI. I think there will be consequences to AI, but I think some of those consequences will be quite positive. I think, like all new technologies, we'll front load some of the downside effects, and then we'll find our way into some of the upside effects. And the upside effects could be quite enormous, could really be great for long-term human flourishing. That said, I agree that a lot of the people who are bringing AI into existence don't understand human nature. When Elon Musk, I've said before, I think he's the greatest living American. I say it in part to piss off everybody who wants to point out that he's born in South Africa, but my point stands. But when he says things like we're going to put everybody on a living wage and you're not going to have to work anymore because we're going to have superabundance, he doesn't appreciate, because he doesn't understand people very well. He understands systems very, very well, and he understands engineering very, very well, and scaling businesses better than anybody maybe who's ever lived. People still elude the guy somewhat. I don't want a nation of dependence. I think there would be nothing worse that you could possibly create than a nation of dependence. But I don't want to stray too far from the direct questions of the night, the ones that we know Tucker was saying. He was certainly putting forward in many ways a Duginist philosophy. The question that I have, Ryan, is that because Tucker, obviously he's had an interview with Dugin, but that only means as much as it means. Is Tucker knowingly and willfully promulgating a sort of Duginist philosophy, or is this just a confluence of distinct perspectives that happen to have united somehow? Like, is Tucker reacting from within the American system to the American system and coincidentally has arrived at a lot of the same ideas of Dugin, or is it something more nefarious than that?
He has chosen to uplift Dugin and other people. Clearly, Putin being the most prominent example, But this stuff with Tucker being kind of friendly towards the Russian regime and presenting them as superior goes back to even when he was at Fox, and it's just been becoming more and more full view. But it's been seeding and it's been in there for quite some time. But it is also part of an overall sort of like a war of ecosystems that's been going on. Russian officials have actually said that they have a comprehensive ecosystem that they want to get Westerners involved in. And what's so important about this is that what's happening with Tucker is a microcosm of what's going to be coming to people's churches. I really want people to understand this. Because in 1987, the Soviets actually put together a team and they realized that communism wasn't working out so well, even though the Soviet Union hadn't fallen yet. And they said, what we need to do is have a new Soviet ideology. They put together a task force. And they said, we have to combine nationalism with Orthodox Christianity and make this new type of, with communism as well, but you wouldn't call it communism. And then we would promote it out there, and this would be part of an ideological offensive on the West and on Christianity specifically. And that same individual then formed a group that promoted not just pro-Russia conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories in general, because it's part of cognitive warfare. They know that if they can make people susceptible to conspiracy theories in general, which naturally gravitate towards an anti-establishment, anti-Western position because they're the ones in power. Conspiracy theories are about those who have overwhelming power. So that's where you're going to default, that they could slip in Russian disinformation. That goes way far back, but then now today, you're seeing Dugin and others, including Putin, really doubling down on promoting this type of multipolar world, Tsarist Christianity, and it's going to be coming through two directions.
So stop there. What is Tsarist Christianity? Is that the Christianity of the Tsars?
Yes.
And tell me how that's distinct from Western Christianity.
It's authoritarian. Dugin has said that basically the Iranian government is divine. He endorses that. And the new spin now is, well, there's two main spins. The first is that Christians in the West have to understand that you have to either be Christian first or America first, because the price of having your freedom is that Christianity withers away. So if you care about Christianity, your faith before your country, you've got to accept a little bit of authoritarianism in there, kind of like Russia. And that's a choice you have to make. And then the other one on a more geopolitical realm, but they're also still twisting it, and this is a conscious deception that Dugin has actually written about, is they're trying to merge these ideologies through end times prophecies. So what the Russian Orthodox Church, which is controlled by Putin, and it's long been controlled by the Russian intelligence, and Dugin is associated with, is now preaching that the end times that they're headed towards, that's imminent, there will be two figures that battle the Jewish Antichrist, which will lead the West. And it will be the Islamic Mahdi. Yes, they're endorsing the messianic figure of Islam as being an ally of Russia. And then the Katechon, which will be an entity or a leader, they say it's Russia, that allies with the Mahdi to wage the battle of Armageddon against the evil Jewish-led Antichrist. And they are going to pour money into this infrastructure. And for people that say that's too crazy of an idea to be normalized, remember, it was too crazy of an idea not that long ago to say that Winston Churchill is the big villain of World War II.
Yeah.
You know, you have a big enough stage, these ideas get out there and people do gravitate towards them. And the Russian Orthodox Church and their allies they're building, Catholic and Protestant, they do have the means to get that into the minds. And so this is coming to your churches.
So do they believe it? Mike, Vladimir Putin has never struck me as being particularly ideological. He strikes me as just a power politics, practical authoritarian guy. I mean, he obviously has a vision for the future of Russia and a vision for a sort of re-emergent Russia after the fall of the Soviets. But ideological? Is he a communist? Is he an ideological heir to the communist revolution in Russia? I don't think so. Is he particularly religious? Is he an Orthodox Christian? I think that's a political question and an identity question as much as it is a theological one. But when we say that Dugin is putting forth an ideology, when we say that Tucker is choosing the Duginist ideology, when we say that Vladimir Putin is as the person ultimately who controls Russian Orthodoxy, trying to bring about an apocalyptic end times vision as a cudgel against the West. I mean, it's hard to imagine all of those things in the absence of a really pronounced ideology. Have I misread Putin?
No, Putin's only ideology is the ideology of a Chekist, which was from the Bolshevik Cheka secret police. So everyone coming up through the KGB, they call themselves Chekists. And so he honors the birthday of the founder of the Cheka. He honors the day the KGB was founded on December 20th every single year. He still refers to himself as president of Russia as a Chekist.
Yeah.
He openly identifies with the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate, but of course the Moscow Patriarch all his life has been a KGB agent. So for him, it's one and the same, and that this is the holy Russia of the Tsarist times, now modernized through Chekist Russia with the Soviet KGB and the Orthodox clergy that collaborated the whole time with the KGB. So that's a comfortable unit there. But Putin himself has no ideology beyond keeping himself in power. He can't leave power. He won't survive. He has no successor. He has no vision for a successor. So he really doesn't see Russia beyond himself. Dugin is very different. He sees Russia as something eternal, something holy, the great holy Russia that's to be divinely led on a divine mission. And as Ryan just said, as the Katechon, or the restrainer of the Antichrist. It's mentioned in Greek in 2 Thessalonians that there will be this Katechon to restrain, and he'll ultimately, once he lets go, the Antichrist will come. So it's Russia's responsibility to hold back the Antichrist, which is the Atlanticists. It's the Anglo-American alliance and its allies, and the Zionists also.
So we talk a lot about, and Tucker talks a lot about evangelicals in America, dispensationalists in particular, as only advancing a foreign policy through the lens of effectuating a particular Christian view of the end times. Are you suggesting that that Dugin is actually doing the exact same thing, that he's advancing essentially a foreign policy from the perspective of Russia into the world to effectuate a Christian view of the end times?
He's incorporating that Christian view of the end times, or a Christian view of the end times. He probably believes part of it, but if you look hard at what he's saying and doing, it's hard to say that he's really a Christian when he equates Eastern Orthodox Christianity, that's as the lead of the traditional religions, as he calls them, but also Catholicism, also Islam, but especially Shiite Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, any religion, old religion that has a hierarchy to it, whether it's an ecclesiastical hierarchy or a social hierarchy. That is what he views as something esoteric, in esoteric terms, meaning these are empty vessels through which he can pour his ideology of this great empire of empires based in Russia. So if you can capture those churches from the top, then you have the religious and moral authority to teach and to approve the policies of the Holy Russian Empire.
And maybe this is cynical, and maybe it's even juvenile. There's a way of reading what you're saying Dugin represents, and what Tucker's saying America represents, that says that both sides are actively trying to bring about an apocalyptic vision of the future, and they actually do. Each fulfills the worst side of the prophecy that the other fears.
Yeah, there's a degree of projection there, it seems like. But with Dugin, it's even deeper, because he bases everything on some 20th century European philosophers and theorists who are pagans and neo-pagans, legit fascists, Italian fascists, and German card-carrying Nazi party members, unrepentant. And these are his main philosophers, and they're either pagan or neo-pagan. Some of them are occultist. So it's a really pre-Christian traditions. And then he's taking the ancient Greek traditions on which much of Western civilization is built, but he's going back to, say, Plato and Aristotle and all their deep philosophy there and their logic. But he's doing it without any of the centuries of Christian refinement that went with it. So he's gone back to pre-Christian Europe, and some of his big philosophical heroes wrote a book, called himself a pagan imperialist, and neo-pagans. And some of them want to have a ancient Greek pagan system of governments, ancient Roman pagan system of governments, or a Norse system of governance, which Dugin also supports. So this has nothing to do with Christianity or the apocalypse as Christians are generally thought of.
But if the guy is a pagan Christian mystic esotericist, is he just like Rasputin for the 21st century? I mean, we've seen this in Russia before, right? This seems like a familiar character.
Well, there was a seduction to Rasputin. Think of all the people he did seduce, like educated, wealthy, people with everything, and he was able to seduce and fool them all. In immersing just myself in Dugin's writings for months to try to master much of what he says, and then you can't just read his stuff, you have to read the philosophers behind it and then figure what they were all about. If you get into it well enough, you can think, whoa, well, this kind of makes sense. There's this evil seduction to it that you have to break away from. And we were talking earlier, we had to go into detox pretty much after reading a lot of his stuff because it has this Rasputin-like effect on you. It's otherworldly.
When you watch Tucker give this speech tonight, and I don't want to get into ad hom. I mean, obviously I have a perspective on Tucker, and I have a way of viewing him that that's no longer charitable. I shouldn't say is no longer charitable, and obviously that colors somewhat what I see. But he does seem like a man swept up in esotericism. He seems like a man who has an actual belief system, and while he couches it in the language of Christianity, he never really puts forward any sort of gospel with his Christianity. Christianity represents, in the same way that he went a long way out of his way tonight not to say that America is soil, but he did say America is land. He did say it is fruited plains and it's mountains and it's rivers. But I feel like the way that he talks about Christianity is like unto how he talks about the fruited plain. It's more of a tactile, visceral reality of the country than it is an actual philosophy or a theology. And yet, Tucker certainly seems to believe something. He never really says what the source of his belief is. He made a fleeting reference to the Constitution today, made a few fleeting references to the founders, but not in the way of, say, the Tea Party from 15, 20 years ago, where it really felt like a populism aimed at restoring the philosophical underpinnings of the American founding. His seems to be much more, his populism seems to be much more blood and soil than that, and yet with ideas. I mean, there was a funny moment during the evening where he started to say that America can't be united exclusively by race. It can't be united by any sort of majority faction because there isn't a clear winner if you're looking for a majority faction. And it seemed very much like he was circling the idea of a proposition nation, of people who had come together on the basis of an idea. But that term is itself not in vogue with his particular constituents. And it's not clear what the proposition actually is that he thinks would unite the country. But there seems to be one. Are we looking at a guy in a kind of religious fervor just for a religion that we're not that isn't easily identifiable to the average American?
That's possible. I mean, in his shows that he's done over the last 2 years, there's a number of times where Christian friends, evangelical friends, almost always reach out to me in alarm talking about how he is more or less outright flirting with some kind of esotericism or Gnosticism, almost accusing Yahweh as creator of being something demonic. I mean, there's places where he gets really into this, and of course associates around him do, but this is where I think what he said tonight and what Dugin believes become really enmeshed. When he started talking at the beginning of his remarks tonight about AI and nuclear war, as though he's like, you know, you have an 80-year-old president who doesn't have any kids except Barron's 18, so I don't know what he's talking about at all. It's like lunacy that he's spouting off, doesn't care whether he destroys the whole world and he's starting a nuclear war, blah, blah, blah. Trump never said he was going to use nuclear weapons. Like, he didn't even intimate that he was going to use nuclear weapons against Iran, as Tucker said.
And by the way, Vladimir Putin has openly threatened to use nuclear weapons
Yes.
in Europe.
Yes. So, I mean, this is a standard projection of accuse your enemy, that what you're thinking, so that, it gets stuck onto them. But there's something very deep here. What he was doing is invoking an apocalyptic vision that, if I hadn't read Fourth Political Theory, or at least some of it, just recently, a few weeks ago, from Aleksandr Dugin. This is his book that was published in 2010 or 12. Fourth Political Theory lays out this idea of liberalism, fascism, and communism are the three political theories of the modern era, that they've hit their end of the road. This is a theme that Tucker came back to over and over again, that America is at some natural ending point. And so they cannot be the political theory for this new, technically, as Dugin puts it, postmodern era. They have to go to something different. But what that fourth political theory is, he doesn't know. It's not articulable yet. He knows it will have elements of liberalism, elements of communism, and elements of fascism. It will appeal more to the soil and into the land because of his land-based philosophy that he carries for his geopolitics. So what he lays out, what Dugin lays out in the very first chapter of Fourth Political Theory, is Heidegger's idea of, this is a really weird, I spent the day, I got to this point, I spent an entire day trying to figure out what this means, digging back into it's been a while since I've looked at Heidegger. I'm having arguments with Grok about Heidegger all day long. Like, what the hell is Erignus, or Erignus? I don't know how to pronounce this. Erignus, I think is how you say it. What is this? What it means is that there's some point at which you've hit the natural end of the entire intelligibility scheme of reality. And at that end point, reality reveals a new way of thinking and being to everybody. And so you can't describe what it's like. You can't give a metaphor. You can't say, oh, it's like you get down to the end of the road and then there's suddenly a new road and reality looks completely different. It is actually about the relationship of how being reveals itself to humans who are in the place. Dasein is Heidegger's idea. They are being there. We are in a place with a culture, with a language, we're just born into this. We're flung, as Heidegger had it, Geworfenheit. We're flung into this being, and being reveals itself to us through our being there. And then suddenly that reaches its terminus, an apocalyptic stop, and something new emerges. And he never defines his fourth political theory. He never explains what it is. It pulls heavily off of the fascism and the communism. It wants to retain some liberalism, and yet he never says what it is. That this has to kind of be revealed by this, mystical process that happens if that's really the end of history. This ties to the idea of his, fourth political theory guiding the new Russian empire of empires that will serve as Katechon to restrain the Antichrist and keep society together for another age, another era. And when I was listening to Tucker speak, it sounded to me like he's caught up in the same stuff. Now, Dugin's impossible to understand unless you understand, as Mike was saying, all of this esotericism. He's not a Christian, just let's point blank. He is a capital T traditionalist. One of these positive weirdos that he bases his thinking off of is René Guénon. René Guénon was another French weirdo in the late 19th century. In his early 30s, late 20s, he converts to Islam, but in a very kind of mystical way. And he writes out this idea that beneath all of the fully hierarchical Orthodox traditions is a perennial philosophy. This is that same New Age, Prisca Theologia, all the religions are ultimately the same if they're good enough. And rather than floating up above them like New Age, you bore down within one tradition till you're ready to be initiated, and a master initiates you into the secrets of how Shia Islam and Russian Orthodox Christianity are actually the same thing. They're outward shells of the same deeper philosophy. And what I feel like Dugin is actually suggesting is that the fourth political theory, he's kind of perverting these ideas. Another one's, by the way, Julius Evola, who is this crazy fascist wizard who believed that he could make himself invincible, walked around in World War II during a bombing raid, caught shrapnel, ended up paralyzed, and then persisted in his delusional beliefs that he could make himself invincible. This guy's a proper crazy person. But you can't understand. He doesn't like wink and nod to these guys. He explicitly says that this is the basis. So my takeaway is that the fourth political theory can't be comprehensible until the current era is allowed to hit its natural endpoint, at which point this mystical underpinning is going to reveal itself as a new way of being in a different world, and the fourth political theory will then constitute itself. That is what Tucker's speech to me, I said it out loud like 10 times upstairs listening in the room together. I was like, I don't know how to say it right. Eragnus is this idea that America is ending. We don't know what it is. All the forces have hit their natural endpoint. They've all conspired to a death spiral where nothing means anything. We have no political rights. We can't even fight the machine. Everything's awful. And yet something new is about to reveal itself. We're about to understand being in a new way. And then the political order that arises from that will seem natural. I don't know that he got this idea from Dugin, but like you asked Ryan, and Ryan said he made a choice. And part of the choice is when he went to Russia, he interviewed a very small number of people, and one of them was Dugin, who is, I just reiterate, a proper weirdo. He's not a Christian. He wrote an essay in the 90s called The Gnostic, where he said there's two forms of spirituality, right-hand path and left-hand path. He doesn't actually say white magic and black magic. He just says left-hand path and right-hand path. Then he argues why the right-hand path is bad, that they never achieve anything in history, and that the Gnostic is the left-hand path character who is a historical agent, even though he dips into the darkness, even though he will destroy everything that is to bring about something new. Those are your great men of history. This guy's a very peculiar character. Tucker is not an amateur interviewer. It's very unlikely. He thought, oh, I'm in Russia. Who will I interview after I stop by the bread at the grocery store and the train station and look at all the art on the wall? I know, I'll just interview this weird philosopher that, a lot of my associates in the weird alt-right space have been platforming and promoting too. Richard Spencer and Nick Fuentes. Nick Fuentes, 19 years old at the beginning of 2018, having a conversation about the foundations of geopolitics and the fourth political theory on a podcast. Steve Bannon meeting with him later in 2018. Jack Posobiec pushing the foundations of geopolitics on his Twitter for years and then deleting all the tweets once people started to realize who he is. Aaron McIntyre, not his real name, at The Blaze, through his own personal podcast, interviews Dugin once and has him in a debate with another proper lunatic, Nick Land, the guy who created, what is it? Is he the neo-reaction guy or something like? I forgot which one he is. Dark Enlightenment, something like this. Something wicked this way comes, and he has Dugin and him debate on what this kind of future of this weird right is going to look like on his platform. This has happened again and again and again, and these are the same people that Tucker has on his show.
It strikes me that I've thought this about Tucker for some time, and I think I'll maybe do a whole show on this because I think it merits some exploration. But Tucker is becoming a product of the East and not a product of the West. You recall a few years ago he said that if his brother committed mass murder, he still wouldn't criticize him publicly. And you think, well, there's a version of that sounds kind of honorable. And then you go, well, honor is the exact right word, because what it really is an honor culture concept. It's a pre-Western, pre-Christian idea.
It's also explicitly, if you read the Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg, who's Hitler's chief ideologist, that was his job as chief ideologist of the Reich. He writes this book, The Myth of the 20th Century, and the second chapter is called Love and Honor. And it's not to say that people should have love and have honor. It is to say these are two competing value sets.
Yeah.
And that effectively, as you're saying, the East or the Nordic German, the Aryan is based off of honor, and that basically Europe has been ruined by falling into positions of love. And he names 3 different types of love that are all poisonous. Most of the chapter is devoted to absolutely trashing up and down in terms that are shocking actually to read, the Catholic Church for destroying Europe under a form of love called caritas, or charity. So this idea of charitable love ruins people, and actually the church hierarchy doesn't even practice it. So it's just a means of enslaving people. And then he points in the next chapter to Johannes Eckert, this kind of Dominican friar who puts forth an extremely heretical view of Christianity as like the true German mystic answer to this, terrible church-led love that's a sham, a fraud, and the destruction of Europe. But these weaken the spirit, right? The second one he puts forth is this idea of humanitarianism, which he attributes to Jews and Freemasons explicitly. And then the third one is Russian sympathy. So he goes quite hard on Tolstoy, talking about how Tolstoy evokes this kind of sympathy, and what it actually reveals is kind of a pathetic character that makes you care about things for the wrong reasons, and thus in a weak and unmanly way. But honor is that which is characterized, and loyalty and duty is what characterizes the Germanic culture. And he describes in the chapter that, or in the previous chapter, that actually that the honor-based German acts, because he acts with honor and sticks to his honor, he says that he's sinless. He doesn't understand this idea that the churches teach, he calls it the Roman African Levantine or whatever, he has all these epithets, idea of sin. No, he's a sinless character. And in that third chapter where he's upholding Johannes Eckhart as the German mystic, as the model for how German spirituality should be, he talks about how whatever you do, sin or not, is right as long as you grow from it, as long as you move forward as an individual and express your true inner being that way. So the Aryan is a sinless creature, so he can do, whether it's murder, whatever it is. So when we talk about the idea of stepping into an honor culture and this East idea, you've got to remember Dugin is no stranger to these Nazi ideologies and ideas also, and that's all going to be steeped in there. How much Tucker is imbibed, I'm not going to, try to guess, but this is deep in Dugin.
Tucker doesn't talk about Russia. Tucker doesn't, there may be occasional references. There was none tonight. And yet, in not talking about Russia, he is saying something. When you talk about, as we mentioned before, when you talk about Donald Trump threatening nuclear war, which I don't think Donald Trump did threaten nuclear war, but to say that and not mention the fact that the Russian government has numerous times over the last 5 years explicitly threatened nuclear war in Europe, that isn't nothing. That's a hell of an omission. To bring up his view that Israel committed a genocide in Gaza, I don't think that Israel committed a genocide in Gaza, but Tucker brings it up. To not mention that Russia is engaged in a war in Europe that's killed, that's resulted in over 1 million casualties, the most destructive war in Europe, certainly since the Second World War. That's another hell of an omission. Is Tucker sparing criticism of Russia out of, is it a dishonest sort of manipulation tactic? It's just not useful to him to point to the crimes of Russia and the failures of Russia in the modern age, because he's really just trying to indict America and Israel. Okay, that's one possibility. Is he sympathetic to Russia, or and he's covering over the sins of Russia out of a kind of allegiance? I suppose that's also a possibility. Is his worldview actually coming out of Russia? I mean, a cynical view might say he's being funded by Russia. I tend not to embrace that. So I think in politics, this is just a bit of an aside, but I think in politics, even if we were to discover, for example, that Qatar is paying Tucker, I don't know, maybe they are, maybe they're not. But in politics, most of the time, you don't get paid to say things you don't believe.
I agree.
You usually get paid because you say things that you do believe, and someone else finds it useful and wants to make it easy for you to keep saying those things. The idea that people are just sort of bought and paid for, it's not that it never happens. That's a very rare.
He's also very rich.
He's also very rich. Now, rich people want to be richer. That's always true. But I have very rarely found people to be paid to say what they don't think. They may find that their incentives lie in allowing themselves to start to believe different things. That's an easier kind of transition for humans to tolerate. But how often has somebody just come up? I mean, we've all been in politics a long time. Has anybody just ever come up to you and said, "Hey, man, I'll give you $20 if you say the opposite of what you think is true"? I've never been approached, and I'm for sale.
Right.
Only product promotion, period.
Right.
Like, here's $20, say you like the hot dog.
Right. Yeah. Of course.
That's it.
But all of this to say, I don't know why Tucker doesn't have any criticisms for the East. And it's not really just Russia. He has no criticisms ever for China. has very few criticisms modern Tucker, recent Tucker has very few criticisms of communism broadly. If you look at his Nicolas Maduro monologue, it was, yeah, maybe he's a communist. Who cares? There's no gay marriage down there, no abortion.
Well,
So is there something unique about Russia, or is this just a general Tucker's beef is with the West, and so that's where he focuses his fire?
there might have been resentment that then was leveraged. I still feel like there's probably more going on besides just Dugin's philosophy, because when you read it, it is so difficult. It is so difficult to understand and to believe in, and he's not like this great, charismatic, funny character. So why does he have these relationships with people that seem to manifest so quickly and so tightly? I feel like there's a lot that we don't know, and we're going to have to speculate to what that is. But what I can confidently say is that I see a consistent pattern where when it comes to the West as a whole, or specific individuals that Tucker criticizes, at some point he always characterizes them as being demon-possessed. And there's always an inference that himself and those around him, even including Alex Jones, have some type of divine blessing or guidance. Or in the case of Alex Jones, he actually suggested he's like type of a prophet. And when I was listening to his statements today, it's all demonization of the West. Every criticism, Russia is much worse by any objective measure. He has chosen to be blind to that. I think he genuinely believes what he's saying. But that is also a result of receiving the ideological product from Russia's propaganda factories. And you can tell because one of the ways that Putin is attacking Christianity and attacking the West is by having this policy that if you are persecuted by neoliberal ideologies in the West, if you're persecuted by the woke, you can get safe harbor in Russia. You can keep your finances maybe in Dubai or somewhere else, a little bit safer, smarter, or you can also move to Russia. There are Americans that are doing that, but it's under a shared values visa. And there's a pretty long list of shared values you have to have with Russia in order to be what they would consider to be a member of the Russian world. You don't have to be Russian to be a member of the Russian world anymore. They've changed it. And so you have to believe in certain things and you have to oppose certain things. And there are so many boxes that are checked by Tucker. And I'm not saying he's not necessarily trying to move there, though I wouldn't be surprised, but it's kind of an open fact that Russia is trying to form an ideological launching pad targeting American Christian conservatives, getting American Christian conservatives to move to Russia to form that launching pad and then attack us digitally that way. Now, Tucker did say, and he claimed that, I guess I should say, that the CIA is putting together a criminal case against him, even though the CIA doesn't do that.
Right.
So he is indicating that he's in some type of danger. He said Russia, of all the countries he's visited, is his favorite one. So I don't rule anything out. If other individuals are facing lawsuits, for example, I'm thinking of Candace, who is actually much more pro-Russia, openly, and much more in compliance with the Russian shared values criteria than Tucker is. She fears losing lawsuits and having her assets confiscated. Even before she went to Russia, I gamed out what are her options, and the only ones I could come up with was moving to Russia and maybe having assets in a place like Dubai. And so when she showed up there and she announced that she was going to Russia, and then I disclosed why she was going there, where she was actually going to this panel at the most
that was
secure.
your story, wasn't it?
It was. It was. It was the most secure part of Russia year-round that you go to outside of a government building, because Putin's Secret Service is there protecting it. So if you want to have a nefarious meeting, that's where you go. And we know from investigative documents, American ones, that one of the purposes of those panels, and she spoke on a panel, is to recruit Western influencers. Now, it gets better. I also found out that some of the meetings she had, people she stayed with, that she traveled with while she was in Russia, supposedly just for this 10-minute meeting, family vacation, the story changed a little bit, were associated with a company that you go to their website, partners with a Russian intelligence operative who operate in the US targeting conservatives, but what they sell is a 100% confidentiality guaranteed process to get the shared values visa to move to Russia if you want, if you feel like you need to get out of America because you're a persecuted Westerner. I mean, that's quite a coincidence, don't you think? And then Andrew Tate showing up at the same time in St. Petersburg that she's there, unannounced, and neither of them acknowledging that they were there at the same time. I mean, there's a lot of weird things that add up.
Yeah, the idea of an American influencer expatriating to Russia and continuing to sort of promulgate anti-American content from Russia. It's a little tough to imagine that they would maintain their credibility once they left. I don't know if the plan.
You have a cult following. Well, first of all, if you feel like you have to go there because your assets are going to be confiscated,
then maybe it doesn't matter.
That gets you there. But then also from Russia's perspective, if you have a cult-like following, they'll follow you wherever you go because now it's about where you're going digitally. You can now plug in that American influencer into this broader ecosystem, so they're not just exposed to the influencer that you're harboring, but the other hosts on that same network. It's a good way to get them exposed to other forms of propaganda as well. So you're moving them away from typical conservative or mainstream news media outlets ecosystems, and you're moving them into the RT-led one, which, by the way, shortly after Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the things that the leader of RT bragged about was the U.S. is shutting down RT in America, but it doesn't matter because we have a, quote, empire of covert projects going to influence American opinion.
Yeah.
So I connect those dots. I think it's a pretty logical dot connecting.
Well, none of this is new, is it? I mean, Tucker loves to bring up the Kennedy assassination and how some documents related to the Kennedy assassination remain classified to this day. But the guy who killed Kennedy was an American influencer who expatriated to Russia and lived in Russia until they eventually realized that he wasn't all that useful to them anymore, and they sent him back home. Russia has been engaged directly in psyops against the country, for a century. And a lot of the history of the 20th century in America has been, if not shaped, deeply impacted by Russian psychological warfare operations in the country. I mean, the only reason we've ever heard of Ronald Reagan outside of appreciating a couple Westerns is because he essentially went to war with the Soviet Union in the SAG strike in Hollywood when Stalin, is purported after seeing his first movie to have said something like no greater tool for propagandizing humans has ever been conceived, and he became a huge film buff, famously after that, and spent real money trying to infiltrate Hollywood, not altogether unsuccessfully. It should be added. So this idea that foreign adversaries, and particularly Russia and China, you brought up Mike Cuba running psychological operations in the country, which of course they do. Iran and North Korea run psychological operations in the country, but Russia has been at it the longest. Russia has the most experience at trying to move American sentiment, and they've. I don't want to say that Russia killed Kennedy. I don't think that that's what happened. But it was certainly a guy who had lived in Russia for a long time who killed Kennedy. This idea of Russia influencing American influencers is a very real phenomenon, yeah?
That's been their great power since the Bolshevik times.
Yeah.
They had no expeditionary army beyond their borders of their empire. They needed to build a movement worldwide, first in Europe and then here, and they had to do that with agents. So why invade a country when you can subvert it cheaply and at no risk? So they were able to recruit teachers' union leaders, teaching schools, seminaries, filmmaking, as you said, journalism schools, news organizations, political campaigns. Even in 1948, Bishop Fulton Sheen made a denunciation of anybody who would vote for a party that allowed itself to be infiltrated by communists. So I mean, you had this. Our whole history has been of that infiltration and a very limited attempt on our government side to protect us from this.
Well, it's sort of it's a weakness in the immune system of a free country, right? I mean, if you have a country that values freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, those are places that we don't like for the government to take not just a heavy hand. We don't really like the government to express its opinions at all in those spaces. But they happen to be three of the most powerful spaces that exist for forming human thought. And if you essentially, and listen, I'm a huge proponent for the First Amendment, like all Americans I thought used to be. And yet I can acknowledge that if you're a hostile foreign government, this is exactly where you would want to focus your efforts, because the place that the government's basically restricted from being able to successfully counter the actions that you take. And I talk about this a lot. We experience it right now in the form of the anonymous internet. The fact that social proof is such a great um, is such a great driver of human behavior. The fact that the anonymous internet allows you to manufacture social proof artificially using, probably in the early days, using foreign account holders, and now probably not even using foreign account holders, just foreign bots, bot farms. You're able to manufacture the idea. And you hear Tucker, and you hear Candace even more than Tucker, use all the sort of leading language, obviously, clearly. Candace always speaks in we's. We see what you're doing. Everybody knows what you're doing. All that's about manufacturing social proof, because once people think that everyone thinks a certain way, it becomes self-fulfilling. People really do start to think that way. So this is, I think this is one of the great challenges of our time. I think that the anonymous internet is one of the great challenges of our time. But I don't claim to know what a country that values freedom of belief and expression can really do to secure itself against these kinds of operations that Russia has perfected running against us for, as you say, for a century now.
Yeah. Well, this is the tragedy of the whole Russia collusion narrative, because one would expect the FBI to be vigilant about this kind of stuff, and that every American should be able to trust what the FBI says on this. We found out that that's not possible.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the problems. But another one of the problems is if you like somebody or you like what he believes in, you're not going to jump on dumping on him, and you're going to protect him, and you'll even go to the wall to protect him. We saw this with non-communist and even anti-communist liberals back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, standing by Alger Hiss and these other Soviet agents. The agents for the North Vietnamese enemy, agents for the Soviets during the nuclear freeze movement, agents of Communist Party members, lawyers, ACLU lawyers who were members of the party, being defended by senators and high-profile people. But you're going to do that because you like them. That makes it impossible for the other side to say, hey, we've got to be vigilant and attack. But conservatives in America have gotten in this comfortable position that, the Russians only target leftists. Yeah, that was true through the Cold War. But even during the Cold War, they were going after right-wingers. They were going after anti-communists to discredit them. And especially now, what better way to disrupt the United States than to fight wokeness, fight globalism, to return to family values, to raise this thing called traditionalism, as if we're going back to, Thanksgiving and George Washington and Abe Lincoln and traditional Christianity. The traditionalism that they're proposing is the destruction of Western civilization.
Isn't there also a physician heal thyself component to this? I mean, Russia is the great proponent of family values. They don't have any kids. They're the great proponent of Christianity. None of them self-identify as being Christian. Russia is a far more secular culture than the United States. They're the great champions of art and beauty. Russia is not producing anything of worth or note in the world in my lifetime. They're the great champions of productivity. Their GDP is a fraction of our GDP. They're the great promoters of peace. As we've already said, they've started a war that's had over 1 million casualties just in the last 5 years in Europe, and as far as I can tell, has no chance of being successful. They may or may not succeed at destroying Ukraine. They may or may not succeed at holding the Donbass or Crimea or something, but they're not going to obtain any actual objective that was worth 1 million of their sons or anything like it. What is it that we're supposed to see in Russia other than these sort of words? What actual proof is there that any of this, that their angle on any of this actually works, that it can bear fruit?
From the Russian side, it was a great empire. It was a great civilization. It produced a lot in terms of cultural value back then. Really, the only beauty you see built in Russia now is restoration of the old stuff that the communists ruined. They have to see a certain greatness among themselves in order to keep their morale as a country.
But that's not what's interesting to me. Of course, they see themselves as great. People should love their country. People should love their history, even when it's flawed. People should love their country, even when it's flawed. That's a prerequisite to being a nation, is a sort of patriotism. What I'm asking about is, why are Americans drawn to the Russian example when Russia has nothing that it can hold up as evidence of the success of the claims that it's making?
Yeah. A lot of it I saw in 2015 or so, when young American men were looking for alpha male role models to lead a country. And there weren't any. We had what? Obama.
Yeah.
Doing this with Raul Castro later on. I mean, this was our president. And there was nobody in Europe. There was no one in the world. But there was this guy coming out of Russia who could, ride tigers and go around shirtless and do all these great things. And he was wearing a cross. And while that was kind of cool to a lot of people. If we only had a leader like that, maybe this guy offers us something new against this Euro sissy wokeness and all this other crap that's being shoved down our throats. And he was talking about family, and he was talking about tradition, and he was talking about rejuvenation of the faith. And that inspired a lot of young, especially young men in America, who were looking for a leader like that. Well, then along comes Donald Trump. That satisfied that yearning for a real alpha male leader, and he was not Putin. So most of the people broke away from that. But some of them who had discovered Dugin by that time, Nick Fuentes being one of them, got into that ideology and pushed it and never let go of it. Some of the guys who flirted with it at the time later on realized, well, this is messed up. I'm out of here. But that appeal for Russia today, it's still there, because we see all the problems among us. We can feel pessimistic about our future.
Of course.
But someplace that's over there that's hard to get to, that has this mystery and this mysticism and this sort of undefinable attractiveness to it, once you look at certain parts of it, all historic, you think, wow, there might be some hope there.
So there's something really deep here. There's something actually really deep, because we talk about the long history of Russian subversive campaigns and propaganda being kind of their most powerful external weapon. Of course, internal as well. They controlled the population. But the way that they did propaganda internally is actually an aesthetic. And that aesthetic has a name that we don't ever talk about. It's an art style. It's called Socialist Realism, or Soc Realism sometimes. Socialist Realism always projects the glorious future that the Soviet Union wasn't producing. They were projecting the productivity into the future, and they cast the laborer who toils for his collective as the hero that was going to bring about that which wasn't there yet. And so this art style has actually been at the center not just of all of the Soviet projects. It was so successful in communist countries, but also in the fascist projects, who projected their own form of this. And this is actually a mechanism by which they can have literally no solid proofs. And this ties to Dugin's philosophy of, a magical rebirth when the thing hits its end and being reveals itself in a new way. They can project an image of that which will be, even though they don't have it yet, in such a compelling term, using this aesthetic, that it's very attractive. And who's it attracting? These young people that you said were looking for alpha males. Not just that. We have at least a generation, arguably two, depending on how you think of the millennials, but certainly Gen Z, that has grown up in such unbelievable destabilization that you might as well think of them as floating around in the ocean, grasping for a life preserver.
Yeah.
And this image being thrown out is that thing. Protestant Reformation, individual liberal, Enlightenment, classical liberal program that's so effete and so false and so weak has led you to have wokeness. Your whole society is upside down. Your pastor preaches in a strip mall. He's just a low church everyman. It doesn't have that huge, deep historical story of the Russian Orthodox Church or the cathedral or whatever. That image of something deep, something substantial, something centuries old, something that touches the source, the rock of Peter itself that hasn't moved in 2,000 years, is appealing to people swirling in the ocean, this cultural ocean. So they can project it with a socialist realist kind of bent. Most of the art style that they still use kind of modifies this. And when I say this about the Nazis taking up kind of the same imagery, the same kind of projective, for them, it was different, right? It was the Aryan German who was going to have the image, and that's new.
Yeah, that's never happened before. We got a sick puppy.
Oh,
Uh,
or Jasper.
Hey, Ryan, if you're nearby, would you come get Jasper and bring me some paper towels? He's, oh no, buddy.
Aw.
He's not doing good.
That's
Ooh.
not good, buddy.
There's no warning to it either.
No.
Yeah.
Hey, buddy. We'll get you taken care of.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, fellas.
No,
It's all right.
Well, too much Dugin will do that to you.
That's what, like we said, detox,
Yeah.
right? It's
I'll
pure
get this.
detox.
Yeah, if you'll take him, thank you.
You got it.
Oh man, I'm sorry, guys.
No.
Totally fine.
Poor pup.
Yeah. Poor
Yeah.
little guy.
He hates communists.
Hey, Dugin, like we said, detox. No, so as I started to say, the Nazi used the same style, but I had the weird experience because of two projects I happened to be working on a project about the Nazis. I was reading Rosenberg's Myth of the 20th Century, and I was like, dang it, I have to pick up Dugin. The moment has demanded it. I have to start. So now I'm reading back. I can't drop my Rosenberg project, so I'm going back and forth, chapter or two of Dugin, and I detoxed by reading this Nazi stuff. And so it was like back and forth, back and forth. And at some point it struck me, I'm like, oh my God, it's the same project. And in a meaningful sense, there is a way that, he's National Bolshevism, Dugin, he's drawing off this Nazi enough to say that he's, that we could say he's Nazi 2.0 in some sense, but not in the literal race ideology, round up all the Jews of Europe and get rid of them, but in the sense that what you have is a people, a national psyche that's been humiliated. The failure of Russia to rise with the czars being, as they took it, crushed by Britain. The failure of the Soviet system to produce and then to ultimately to collapse, to undergo this perestroika, this restructuring that didn't deliver a liberal democracy that could enter into the world on a new term, this failure. So I saw the two philosophies in twin as therapeutic balms for a humiliated national psyche. So just like Mike was saying, you've got the Russians are not telling you what they have now. They have socialist realist imagery at the projection of what could be when they return to the mythical past and restore what they were always supposed to be that gives them that sense of national pride, which was the race for the Germans, and it's the land-based traditional values for the Russian, the imperial nature. Dugin actually says, by the way, in Fourth Political Theory, that to ask, he doesn't say it this exact way, but he does say it this way. He says to ask the Russians to join the liberal order of the world, the Atlanticist, would be to ask Russia not to exist. To see, Russians would no longer be Russian if they're not imperialist. And so there's something deep core in the psyche of what it means to be a Russian, and that layer of humiliation activates. And this is the same layer of humiliation. It's activated by the ideology, which is projected by the aesthetic and the claims and the bravado and, Putin out there at 70 years old doing a judo move or whatever with his black belt and no shirt on. It's projected into this Western mind that's swirling in the ocean of postmodern cultural relativism, of woke liberating tolerance, where there's a two-tier justice system and it's the opposite one that you might think. It's not the majority oppressing the minority. It's now the other way around in the name of social justice. These poor kids are searching for something deep-rooted in all of this, and this image is that deep-rooted thing. The socialist realist image of a national psyche that's been corrupted by the outside forces. For Germans, it was the Jews and the liberals and democracy. And for the Russians, it's this Atlanticist West. We have strangled.
And for
Russia.
young men in America, sadly, it seems to be the Jews again. It's liberalism and the Jews.
It usually comes back to the Jews. Yeah.
So, but here's the thing. If I grant your premise, and I think that I do, that young Americans, particularly young men, are so disenchanted with the state of our culture today that they're looking to Vladimir Putin as a role model, that they're ripe to fall into the promises of a Nick Fuentes, to trust the plan, to look up to Thomas Massie, to look up to Tucker Carlson, is the very fact that they are in that position proof that they're right? Maybe not in some of the conclusions of where they should go, but in the fundamental conclusion that the West has failed them. Because had it not failed them, they wouldn't be looking, they wouldn't be tempted by the shirtless guy riding the tiger and doing judo at 70 years old.
No, I think so, actually. And I think that this is why an accurate diagnosis is so important, because the West hasn't failed them except in that it let itself become this mondialist project that Dugin describes, but then wrongly says is all we are and all we ever were, and it's the logical conclusion of who we started out. And it's the inability to see that this promise that looks promising is a false promise, because in fact, yeah, you're right. They have been tossed around in the seas. They have lost their sense of rootedness. They are attracted to Protestantism. You know, the low church model doesn't have that Rock of Peter 2,000-year-old tradition, and at least I can put my feet on something solid if I convert. But then at the same time, they don't. I call this being right on the narrow point while being wrong on the broad point. And this is why the diagnosis is correct. Mondialism has failed them. The West has been mondialist, especially once the Bushes got the reins of the conservative movement starting in 88, and maybe sometimes near the end of Reagan's time. I don't know. Certainly, this has been a major failure. At least, like I said, maybe it had its day, and its day either ripened badly or it expired ahead of time and it was time to go on. And they're right that this has failed them, but it's not the West that has failed them. It is not the idea of limited government, self-government, the tied ideas of liberty and responsibility that a free man who makes his decisions has responsibility for what those decisions and their outcomes are because he's free. These ideas and the bet that the American founders made, which by the way was, I know a lot of people get all worked up when you invoke John Adams because he helped establish, I should say, a state church in Massachusetts. But John Adams in 1765 writes this incredible essay called A Dissertation on the Canon and Feudal Law. It's about the Stamp Act, but he barely mentions the Stamp Act. What he actually does is goes through the history of why Americans at that point became American, which isn't to say nationally American. They still saw themselves as British subjects. Why did they flee Europe? And it was because the combination of these two tyrannies, the canon and feudal law, were so outrageously oppressive that they were willing to risk everything for their religion, which meant the practice of their religion, which meant religious liberty above all. That was the promise of America, was we will be allowed to worship freely here. And then, of course, ironically, John Adams fails of this, writes to Thomas Jefferson near the end of his life, it's not working. A few years after he dies, they disestablish Massachusetts because it wasn't working. It was a huge mess. And plus the church it was established on split, which was awkward,
That hurt,
to say the least. Who's going to be in charge now? And this idea, though, of a refused traditionalism that's like a Russian patriarchate type model or a Catholic integralist type model, whatever else you want to say about it, the founders, John Adams included, the most conservative among them, very clearly rejected this as what it was meant to be in America. America was meant to be something else. And so what we have failed this generation and the previous generation, besides allowing them to be awash, my hypothesis, by the way, is the neo-Marxism and the Mondialism mated in the 60s. And they've been symbiotic, actually. It's like the parasite went inside and you can't tell them apart anymore. So there's no point where one starts and the other begins or whatever. That's why everything's so woke. But what we've failed to do is to communicate to them actually, truly who they are as Americans, what our forefathers believed, what we sacrificed and why we sacrificed and what they sacrificed way ahead of us. And that's the real failure, because if they knew that, they would look at this offer and they'd scoff at it. They'd laugh at it. They'd look at it the same way as when I read this Nazi ideology and I laugh like, holy crap, people believed this. Wow, this is stupid.
But how do we correct it? If the system, what's being told to them today and what they believe and what we may even grant some of, the system's failed. They're being told by people who want authoritarian rule in this country of one stripe or another, left and right, that the answer is politics has failed. Politics cannot be redeemed. It's time for a new way. It's time for the America that you've known to end. It's time to build something new. What's the alternative position? So there is hope within our politics. No, there is hope in the old structures. If we're granting that the old structures have failed, how can we say that the hope is still in the old structures?
I do
And
think,
therefore, what today is the bulwark against tyranny?
right. I do think there has to be a massive updating to the education that the youth are getting in regards to how to conduct civil discourse, how to spot some of this that's going on. I don't think that we've adapted to some of these problems, and therefore they're vulnerable. But I also noticed something after the October 7th attacks. When I tried to look up every single group involved in the more violent protests on college campuses that I could find, and I looked at the individual protesters, not just their politics, but their personal lives. And there were a few things that I realized I hadn't prior, which is, yes, there's a lot of ignorance and there's a lot of extremism and things like that, but it does start with exactly what you said, which is first is that it's a conclusion that life shouldn't be this hard, a absolute terror about how they're going to be able to handle life if they can. After they graduate, absolute terror. And it's all pessimism. And I think that we shouldn't kid ourselves into saying that it's just completely illogical or a fad. They will cite articles, they do read studies. But the other thing that I really hadn't seen before, is that as crazy as the youngest generation can be, they're very good. They have huge hearts. I mean, the way that they take pride in themselves is by helping other people. It's not just like, wow, how expensive is your clothing? Or anything else like that. Like, it's cool to be part of a cause and to help other people. And one of the things I would see when people say, well, why are you going to these protests? And especially the ones that were not on board with everything being said at the protests, is they say, well, I'm doing the best I can to make a change. I don't have much time to make a change because, like, I don't have any money, but money I have has to go help my family with healthcare bills and things like this. They want to make a change, and the only ones that are coming to them, especially in a non-political context, at a young age, middle school and high school, and saying, here's how you can get ahead in life. Here's how you can make a difference and help people because you understand that that's equivalent to your self-worth. Are groups that tend to be a little bit more radical, or they're not radical, but then the digital ecosystem they get them into is one where all of the things that we were saying, well, how does Russia offer anything? How does anyone point to anything? All of that seems very real. If you follow the extremist chats, the TikTok ecosystem that they get into, all this seems crazy to us, but that's because we're not in that ecosystem. You go in there, it seems very logical. It does seem better, and you do reach the conclusion that maybe these are all out-of-date artificial structures oppressing us, and just by virtue of it burning down, there will be a purifying fire. And we don't even have to argue about whether Marxism or anarchism or pro-Russia traditionalism will arise. Whatever is natural and truly good will arise. We just need the purifying fire.
Yeah, this is the principles underneath have not rotted. Some of the system structures through conscious decisions that were made, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for bad reasons, or sometimes for short-sighted reasons that were good in the short term and not as good in the long term, got transformed. This is why I said diagnosis is so crucial. And I said earlier that we have this problem. Dugin recognizes it, Russia recognizes it, the multipolar world recognizes it. It's called Mondialism. It's this stupid philosophy that the EU represents, and every one of these idiots that comes out, this Sanchez in Spain, they all represent, oh, we need to have compassion to the people who've just conquered Ceuta or whatever, right? Like, no, actually, you need the military is what you need. This idea has failed them, but MAGA is already a different answer, and it is make America great again. So where do you reach in? It's like, why don't we start teaching them what is America? If we're going to make America great again, the idea is that we're going to make this thing called America be better in a way that, you know, maybe we think it used to be, or just great. What is it? And this is where I think that we have so much opportunity. You know, it's America 250. We talk about the founding. We can read what they actually wrote. We can read the debates, the Federalist, Anti-Federalist debate, et cetera, et cetera. They recorded so much of this. They thought it was so important. And I think that we have an opportunity to remind them that the principles got betrayed and created a system that we don't have to be wedded to. And the post-liberal movement has a point that the system that they're looking at is a monstrosity. But what they're doing is misdiagnosing what the system is, and then they're blaming the wrong set of principles. It's this weird globalist idea that arose after World War II, and especially with the liberationist infusion in the 1960s, the neo-Marxist infusion. And that was a word Tucker used, by the way, is liberation, right? Like, woo. That thing was a mistake. At best, it had short-term benefits. It was largely a mistake, and it was an opportunistic entryist move for the communists through the neo-Marxist and even Soviet lines of active measure. But we don't have to, burn down the principles of America because they're not continuations. They're perversions. The switch in the wake of the Civil Rights Act, and not the Civil Rights Act itself, but in decisions like Griggs versus Duke Power in 71 to reform the meaning of discrimination based on this concept disparate impact, which, by the way, Trump's DOJ, Harmeet Dillon in the Office of Civil Rights, is fighting this tooth and nail and will probably win, which will transform so many things in the woke world. This was a perversion of the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment by turning it into an equitable protection clause of the 14th Amendment based on Soviet concepts of actual equality or social equality beyond economic equality. And this was a perversion of our founding principles. This was a perversion of the idea, as Tucker called it, of fairness, where each person is to be judged as an individual responsible for their actions and held to account by their character. This is something that can be, what I'm saying is they're looking at the right thing, blaming the wrong cause, and turning people against our country rather than turning people against the face hugger that has stuck on the side of it. Yeah. And we can stop the face hugger without saying we need this other, burn it all down, or this completely other philosophy, this Eastern philosophy to replace what we've had because it might be better.
So I want to talk specifically about Tucker's remarks tonight a little bit. Bring this a little out of the philosophical and a little into the practical and political. One of the most astonishing aspects of the speech from my point of view is just how much Tucker disparaged Donald Trump by name and the Trump administration. I said earlier, like half the administration by name. That's an exaggeration, but he certainly, there's actually a kind of funny Tuckerism where he said something like Pete Hegseth jumps around like a monkey and wants to start wars and murder people. Not that we dislike him, we like him very much. Yeah, with friends like you, buddy. Obviously, Tucker has been more and more hostile to the administration over the last 6 months. This felt like a true declaration of war against the administration, except in one way. He did say, when he was saying that 80-year-olds with no children, ignoring that Barron Trump exists, 80-year-olds with no children or whose children are only in their 50s don't care about nuclear war because they have no time horizon. They don't care about the future because they have no time horizon. They don't have a future. He said, if you had a 40-year-old with 4 kids in the White House, they wouldn't be starting these wars.
Wonder who that is.
Wonder who that is. There is a 42-year-old vice president with 4 kids. It strikes me that it would be very difficult for J.D. Vance not to repudiate Tucker after this speech. I mean, this speech is a declaration of war against the administration. And yet Tucker was careful to slip in this reference to the fact that, well, I mean, if J.D. Vance was president, that might be okay. That might actually fix the problems. Knowing both of those two facts, how does that impact, Mike, your view of a future Tucker third party? Or is all of this some sort of move to help elect J.D. Vance president?
Yeah, it's all just guesswork. But if he did give a cutout, give the vice president the benefit of the doubt, then he's holding out that he may be nominated. And if he's not nominated, there might be another party to run as a spoiler.
Interesting. So you think this is more akin to the sort of threatening, do the 10 things I say, or there's going to be a revolution. In the same way he might be saying, ascend J.D. Vance, or I'm going to start a third party.
It seemed a holdout for that. I wasn't sure what to expect. I really thought he would announce something big tonight.
Yes.
So now that he has that unnamed holdout there, But you have a lot of those 10 items on the agenda are already the president's big items.
So, yeah, for sure.
You know,
Well, I actually want to talk about all 10 of the items because
Can I
I
just
think
say before that
Please.
he's attacking this declaration of war against the administration is because it's succeeding, right? This is like Mike just said, this is what President Trump's already doing. It's just slow to get results, and some of it has to be politically unfavorable. Just to take the Iran war, for example, in the geopolitical sense, even drawn from Dugin, besides the fact that he devotes almost an entire chapter spread out throughout a multitude of chapters in the Foundation's Geopolitics to the necessity of an allyship with Iran on the principle of common enemy, he says, but also this traditionalist parity between Shia Islam and Russian Orthodoxy. He's talking about the control of the rimland around the Eurasian continent and the fact that it's in Atlanticist Western hands, and that has to end so that the Eurasian empire of empires centered on Moscow can arise. And therefore, when he starts, everything they're saying about Iran points to the fact that Iran is literally, in some sense, the cornerstone of the entire Eurasian, whether it's BRICS, whether it's China's Belt and Road or New Silk Road or whichever, the maritime and land routes, and then the Russian ambitions to have warm water ports and a friendly regime and a destabilizing regime to keep everything messed up around Israel and the United States. All of that strategy hinges on keeping Iran in the hands of this new axis that's arisen on the Eurasian continent, supercontinent. And Trump is busting that up big time. And I think the panic that they're showing is because it's working. Trump might actually regain control of the main piece for the Belt and Road Initiative to succeed. Falling into American-friendly hands would be a catastrophe for Russia, China, and all the rest of them.
what is the main piece that could fall into American hands?
Iran.
How?
Not American hands, American-friendly hands.
Okay.
An Iranian regime that replaces the IRGC, that sees America and maybe Israel as major allies.
Do you still think, given the reality of how the war has transpired over the last 6 weeks, that that's still a real possibility?
I think that that's the strategy. I think that's why we keep hearing the word degrade the IRGC, degrade. Why? Because rather than blowing it up and creating a power vacuum that gets filled with who the hell knows who, not a friend probably, some lunatic faction or a civil war of them fighting for control, we end like some of the remaining whatever IRGC guys, et cetera, you wait until you weaken and wait until you have in position a real potential ally that could rise up, not through nation building, but through an actual organic return to power of the rightful leaders of Iran, who are going to be grateful to the United States and Israel for helping them and become this ally. Well, all of a sudden, now if we go back to Dugin's geopolitical strategy, this keystone of their whole project, the absolute crossroads of the land route, two of the major lines for the maritime route, which Strait of Hormuz is one of those, all of a sudden fall into Western-friendly hands, and the Atlanticist anaconda, as he calls it, constricts the Eurasian continent again, and they never get their glorious day in the sun. So in a practical sense, if Tucker's working in alignment with this, and everything he says sounds like it is panicked insistence that fighting in Iran is a bad idea, which is echoed online by every possible apologist, trying to get this war to get dropped so that the IRGC, even dilapidated as it is, stays in some kind of power, speaks to me that this is a grand strategy to make sure that this last major domino of the Eurasian project and the multipolar lie that facilitates it doesn't fall. Because if they lose Iran, they lose the game. China loses the game. Russia loses the game. And of course, Iran is the IRGC, the clerics lose the game. And the whole world reorganizes. Rather than what they call Asian century from 2050 to 2150, we might be looking at what they're calling actually Pax Silica, led by the United States, Israel, and its other allies, which is a completely different world with a unipolar alliance running everything again.
I want to ask my question one more time. You say you think that that's the strategy. Okay. Is that outcome still possible? Or has America blundered in Iran so greatly that it cannot?
I think when I say it's the strategy, I mean, it's not the strategy anymore if it's impossible. I think
You
Trump
mean
is,
it's actively the strategy?
I think Trump is playing a much more sophisticated game of chess with all of the regional players, including expanding and cornering people into the Abraham Accords who are skittish. I think he's playing a much more sophisticated game of chess than people are giving him credit for. It's not 5D chess. It's regular
the old-fashioned
chess.
kind.
It's just chess on a board, right? And the game is that imagine a game of chess where if you just knocked out the queen or the king, I mean, they get to replace all their pieces with queens and obliterate you, because that's what happens if you just create a power vacuum in the region. It's just going to be regional dysfunction and a mess and probably some warlord taking power. If you degrade and you keep playing this let's make a deal game back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, not only do you strategically give yourself time to ramp up your own war production, which is apparently necessary, you also discredit them on the world stage, and you give time and space for a possible allied faction not to be put in position by the CIA like George Bush, or U.S. troops, but rather to be able to organize itself to become that ally. And I think he is slowly. It's the same anaconda strategy that the Russians hate, but now it's just working on that one country, twisting them more and more. So I'm totally confident in President Trump's ability to execute this particular war game, except the weakest piece is his right-wing American home base that is rapidly turning on him through the voices of people like Tucker Carlson and all the rest, who have made it like their primary object.
Well, to the extent that Tucker says tonight that a system, you can know the purpose of a system by its outcome. If the outcome of the Tucker et al. Movement is to bring America defeat in the Middle East, then that was its purpose. I mean, if that's, according to his standard, if that's the outcome that's effectuated, that was the purpose.
There's a certain irony in that. I totally agree. I think that the trajectory actually is towards the defeat of the multipolar world project. But the ideology I personally refer to as the global seditionist movement, because that's the only thing I can see as unifying all of these different factions from the far left, far right. But the seditionist movement of the multipolar world could succeed in the United States. And what was really interesting was how he first said there might be a third party, but there might be multiple. And the reason I believe that is because this process actually is happening on the left also. In 2024, a lot of the same rhetoric was happening where they're saying, maybe it's good for Trump to win because then we can say to the Democratic Party, you only win if we allow you to win. And the same rhetoric's happening on the right. And now these people are going to each other's podcasts. So it's all coalescing into one. And so to me, the fear isn't that they're going to get a majority of the American vote. I think the debate that's happening is, do we have two separate parties that coordinate to influence both primaries? And then during the general election, do we work together or do we form another party where we kind of come together? Because they can really win in the United States, I believe, if they can just imagine they get 15% of the vote, 20% of the vote, and they're able to con the American people into thinking that these are actual voters. Many of them actually don't vote, particularly on the far left. But they can say, especially to the well-paid political consultants who need to win in order to survive, say, well, we control the swing vote in all of these close elections. When it comes down to it, you want to win it all? We hold the keys. You want a paycheck? We hold the keys. And I bet you'll see a lot of people, including ones that you think are good people, get weak knees and say, you know what? I think we can appease them. For the sake of winning elections, we can appease them. Yep. And then guess what? They own the process. If we give up objective morality that way, they own the process. And that doesn't necessarily happen overnight. It can come with a series of compromises that happen. But I think their strategy can work.
Trust the plan.
Yeah.
Think of this almost as a game or an exercise where we'll keep it like to 3 sentences or less. But I want for people who maybe tuned in for a little bit of Tucker, it was a lot to sit through the whole thing. And they're watching us and they're like, you guys have brought up words like freedom and healthy and honest. I don't understand what the problem here is. Why do we just devote the evening to talking about some esoteric philosopher and on the other side of the world instead of actually talking about Tucker's speech? I want to go through the 10 things that Tucker wants for the country and talk about where the objection is to the particulars of what he said. Because, again, if you just read this list, I think this is the purpose of the list, 10 out of 10 Americans will agree with this list. I think 10 out of 10 Americans will agree, even with the second. If the first thing that he said is the word on the list, 10 out of 10 Americans, 9 out of 10 Americans are going to agree with the second word, which was the first thing that he would diagnose as being a problem. But he probably spoke for 15 minutes on each one of these, and once you got past the first 3 minutes, things could take real turns. So first, and I'll give this one to you, Mike. What's wrong with the statement that America should be more fair? Tucker posits that the fundamental inheritance of the American is fairness, that the American system was created by the founders for more than any other reason to be fair.
It wasn't created to be fair. It was created to be that every citizen is equal under law. That's not fair. Fairness to me, the way a lot of people say it, means DEI. It means leveling it in a socialistic kind of way to make it fair for everybody, to bring everybody down. So I don't really understand what he means by fair, because it has nothing to do with the American founding.
James?
I mean, the real reason for the American founding, I already told you, John Adams wrote it in 1765 as explicitly as could be, was for liberty. It was for religious liberty in particular, and in fact, that your conscience won't be laid upon. So there's at least a factual error there. I know we're going to be brief on this, but there's a factual error. That is not what America was founded for, was to be fair. It was to have the government leave you alone in terms of at least your sets of beliefs and your conscience and your speech. So that's wrong, but I agree with Mike. If you're going to say fair, you need to be very clear, because that's exactly what the left is appealing to. It's exactly what the Soviets were appealing to. It's not fair. The bourgeoisie has all the power. They have all the money. They have all the opportunity. And right now, Tucker spent half his time talking about some global cabal of elites like Jeffrey Epstein, who can get away with everything. Forgot that he went to jail and died there or something, but he didn't get away with everything. He was a good operator. It made it very hard to prosecute stuff by mixing innocent and guilty people in his lists. But the system still applies actually equally to everybody, despite appearances. So it seems like he doesn't actually want it to be that way.
Sovereign, Ryan.
Well, he makes it sound like we're an occupied country, which is ironically the name of a pro-Hitler film that went a little viral on X, made by people in that orbit who are also pro-Russia and pro-Iran. So his idea is that therefore you need to liberate America. How do you do that? By any means other than force. All this language is revolutionary language, going back to his indirect threat of implement my genius ideas that I've aggregated from all the crazy people around me. Otherwise, a lot of people will die.
It did strike me that when he talked about sovereignty, it seemed like it was a sort of corporate sovereignty. It wasn't that you, the individual, are free. It was that the country is free of the Jews.
Yeah. And he would, of course, deny that it was Jewish, but he would say, oh, well, it's
Israel.
The international Israel, the Zionists, the international banks in Ukraine, and all this. But the overall idea is just artificial oppressive structures that are so bad, because he paints such a gloomy picture, that violence that otherwise would not be justifiable, things just might be different now or very soon.
Also, after specifically saying that one of the things we're slaves to is Israel, he spent most of sovereignty, Mike, talking about debt, which I found very interesting, because his first 2 points, both fairness and sovereignty, ended up being these sort of left-wing economic populism ideas more at home in left-wing economic populism, that we should all have more resources and that our economy should not be debt-driven. Struck me that he conflated high-interest debt and low-interest debt. He painted with the exact same brush. He referred to the problem of debt as being about 25% interest credit cards, but then he would seamlessly transition into talking about the problem of mortgages, which there are no 25% mortgages in this country, right? There are very few 6% mortgages in this country.
Right. And there are a lot of advantages to having a mortgage, because you can't pay, most people can't pay cash for their house.
It's one of the reasons America is one of the few countries where people own houses as opposed to
Yeah.
living in a rent culture.
Yeah, and if you bring rates down with a better government spending and a more solid dollar, then you're going to have lower interest rates to make houses more affordable. So mortgages can be good, especially with the tax advantages that he hinted at. But the debts that he's talking, credit card debts, are debts that people voluntarily incur, knowing what the interest rate is. So if you're spending money that you don't have, you know that you're going to have to repay it, and you know the interest. So that's equality. That's freedom. You don't have to incur any of those debts.
Well, one interesting point that he made, and you never hear anyone on the right talk this way, certainly no conservative speaks this way. He said, the average American isn't capable of not using that debt. He said, you're making this debt so accessible that you couldn't, these weren't his exact words, I don't have the quote written down, but he made the point that you cannot expect the average person not to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, it strikes me that that's a declaration that people aren't in fact sovereign, which is why I point out that all of his talk about sovereignty seems corporate, not individual. I mean, if a human being doesn't have a choice about using, if you can't accept through a sort of extreme frugality or piousness, resist high interest loans, that I don't know that you could, that I don't know why we would give you freedom.
I mean, you can with credit cards actually avoid the high interest loans because you get an entire month where the interest doesn't apply, at least if you make a minimum payment, not even the full payment. So like I agree with Mike, but he called it slavery, Jeremy. He said it's slavery that we have mortgages. No, what he's doing is speaking to, and this is what really irked, this is where I stopped standing and watching and started pacing and swearing behind everybody. So much so that one of the guys came over and asked me if I needed like a special stool, like I was in pain or something. I was like, no, I'm mad. He's radicalizing young, economically illiterate people by making them feel stress and anger about the debt, that it enslaves them and that the system forces them into it, so they're no longer sovereign individuals. And this is just economic illiteracy. What you were actually doing is leveraging somebody else's money to be able to acquire things you could not otherwise acquire. The idea of understanding that money itself, capital itself, has time value multiplied by risk, right? The credit card interest rates are so high because they're high risk for the credit card company. So you take the time value of money. I can do stuff with my money. If I give it to you for a time, a year, I can't do anything with it because you have it. But you can go do something. So if you say, hey, James, you can make 10% on your money. I can make 20% on your money. Let me have it. And I say, okay, cool. Let's write a contract. And you cut me in on half of the extra. That's called interest. That's basic, like foundational economics. But your average, high school student or college student who hasn't passed economics or didn't listen doesn't know that. And they're going to get angry about this stuff. And then he, of course, ties it to usury and all this. And he says that this is a system that's enslaving you rather than a system that's giving you the opportunity to voluntarily decide. You can rent forever if you want. I know people who are in their 50s that have never owned a house. They've rented their entire lives. You have that freedom. It's not economically wise, in my opinion. It's smarter to sign up and to leverage other people's money to advance your own equity. And I found it hilarious. I paid off my house in 11 years. I worked my ass off. I ate spaghetti with like no sauce. Like we paid our house off in 11 years. We worked hard to do that. And he's like, the government punishes you for paying off your house early because you don't get the mortgage tax credit anymore. Are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
No, you don't. This is the most financially freeing thing that's ever happened in my life. And he's telling people who have no way to know this, because he's speaking to young people, the exact opposite of good advice. And I was so pissed off that that's when I started looking at him. I know you don't want to do ad hom, but I was like, he has sociopath eyes. I was like getting mad, like get it down to, those are sociopath eyes.
Yeah, I will say that saying that that the government penalizes you by not giving you a mortgage interest deduction when you don't have mortgage interest is a very manipulative way of framing that. Similarly, talking about the capital gains tax as being half the income tax, well, first of all, that's just not accurate. I mean, that's not true effective tax rates. It is not double. But it's also not understanding the purpose of tax code. We do, for better or worse, we do try to incentivize certain behaviors in the tax code. We want people to own houses because it's economically good for them to own houses, and it's societally good for them to own houses. And so we give them the mortgage interest deduction in the tax code to make it easier for them to own a house. If you don't own a house, you don't need it. We don't want to incentivize you not to own. We don't want to incentivize you to rent. You don't get a rent deduction the same way because that's not the preferred behavior. Similarly, we want people to invest into the future instead of spending all their money. Tucker says he's against consumerism and the dollar store and the fact that we just buy cheap stuff. Yes, that's part of what we're trying to incent by having the capital gains tax rate be lower than the income tax rate. I mean, first of all, you earn the money that's working for you in the market and already paid income tax on it. But secondly, we actually want you to think that there's advantages to being thoughtful about the future of your money instead of just expending all of it in the moment. That kind of brings us to the third point, which was he said America should be productive. And he devoted a lot of his productivity talk to farming. And I'm going to let somebody else field the farming question. But it did strike me that he said America used to be productive. He said the Soviets weren't. The Soviets only produced ugly cars that didn't work and ran on kerosene and broke down every 3 miles. He says, but America produces nothing. And I thought, no, we literally produce cars now that drive themselves in this country. So your very example, if automobiles are the example, the greatest automobile ever conceived of in the history of humanity is being manufactured in this country right now.
I flew here on a sweet 737 that was made by Boeing, which is an American company.
In this country.
Yeah, it's cool.
It's cool.
It's cool.
Well, that's why he's anti-technology too. Remember, like he makes it sound as if technology is almost satanic. Which, by the way, Candace's husband has actually preached that as well. So that actually does come from an ideological current that says that America's advantages in technology is actually evidence of its satanic powers. But think about how he described how we won the Cold War. He said because the Soviet Union had a bad system because they had bad product. Our products were better, therefore we won. Now think about his trip to Russia and the supermarket thing, which was hilarious, where he showed just how he's so rich he doesn't understand the everyman that he tries to present himself as, where he was so fascinated by the coin going into the shopping cart. What was the argument there? Oh, Russia produces better product than America. But he didn't say that in that because just like you accurately pointed out, there was a strategic decision not to make that comparison tonight in this context, but you can link it to these other patterns.
There's another aspect, too, that no president has done more than President Trump
Exactly.
to bring manufacturing back home.
Yeah, like them or not, the tariffs, if you think they're good, if you think they're stupid, their intention is to bring it back home. There's some evidence that it is bringing it back home. This is the autarky question. Should we produce everything at home? I think there is. I think Tucker didn't lie to say there's a national security implication that, for instance, we have 0 primary lead smelters in the United States because of EPA regulations shutting the last one down a few years ago, that we have something like 2 steel mills, fully functional steel mills. There are issues. We do need to be able to ramp up production if, you know, the shit hits the fan or whatever. We should be able to produce our own bullets from primary ore if necessary. And so, but the question is,
we only have one factory not factory is probably not the right term. We only have one facility in the country that can make the fundamental ingredient in solid rocket fuel, which is why we can't build Patriot interceptors at the same speed that they can build missiles that we need to knock out of the sky.
right, and we have nobody that can figure out how to work the machine that makes the chips. So that's why they're made all in Taiwan. Is because somehow they figured out how to work the machine that they didn't even build, and we
can't even make IMAX projectors anymore. So what's Christopher Nolan going to do?
That's right. But the question of
National security.
autarky is this idea that, oh, well, we need to have all the ingredients here to solve all of our own problems. And the question is, at what cost? There is a balance here. Hitler thought the same thing in the 1930s, and he decided Germany was going to be completely self-reliant. Everything was being made in Germany. So for a lot of core industrial products, he did bring it all home. He did create manufacturing jobs. Germans did get kind of pressed into working in them in a very gently way. And a lot of the products were costing over 5 times what they would pay if they imported them because they just couldn't make them as efficiently. And so this total self-reliance idea, this is not always your best option, but you should have enough to have a fallback. But Tucker didn't present it this way. He didn't present it as a reasonable balance between competing issues, including jobs and including national security, et cetera. He presented it as, we don't make anything anymore, where we make tons of stuff. Yeah. And it's funny because it's like, he's sitting there, just to point it out again, he's producing a podcast. in some nicotine pouches that he had in his lip the whole time he's talking on his show. Like, what in the? You're not producing anything, Tucker. Like, kiss my ass.
Yeah, the nicotine pouches, it's very peculiar that he keeps them in his mouth when he does his monologues. I found it incredibly distracting. Also, later during health, which is point number 5, he spent a lot of time talking about how Americans are all addicted to drugs, which is just interesting for a guy who can't even get through a monologue without pouches full of nicotine that he personally sells. But before we get to beauty or to healthy, beautiful was his next one. He said that we don't make anything beautiful anymore. And he had a line that I'd never heard before: beauty is truth. That's quite a bold claim, I think.
I guess he
romantic.
thinks he is beautiful, I guess.
Yeah, right.
I mean, I don't really
That
get
sounds
it.
romantic, actually. It's that romantic idealism that's a little bit scary. But like, he actually said we don't produce art. Tell me about your series, Pendragon. Tell me about, did you produce any art? Does America? No, we're not creating paintings the way that we used to,
Right.
because it's not the main vehicle for using visual techniques to tell a story.
That's
We're-
right.
We have another technique that brings people to tears, that can launch a war, literally, that can change the world. Like back in the, what was it, the 80s with the Coca-Cola, just people singing this dopey little song about like peace and, you know, teach the world to sing and perfect harmony. It's like we have different modes of art that maybe we can try to compare the relative validity, but to say that we don't make anything beautiful is ridiculous.
Yeah, as a filmmaker and a lover of American popular culture, it did really offend me. This idea that the only thing that matters is paintings. Of course, the painting is not the dominant art form, or architecture. As I said at the beginning of the show, you can disagree with the choices that we've made in the second half of the 20th century to make of how we designed our buildings, but it wasn't without the human in mind. It was just the human inside as opposed to the human outside. Maybe there's a future in which we can blend those two concepts, but
Part of the reason
that's not a conspiracy.
part of the reason that we don't build the glorious buildings, the glorious cathedrals, is because we don't have a king who's going to take all the glory to himself for having commissioned the project.
And also,
Over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
and also one reason we don't spend centuries building churches anymore, there is something important that's lost, that we don't have 300-400-year building projects or 500-year building projects for cathedrals. And yet America is the place where the church has grown and prospered for the last century, while it's been declining all through the countries that have those beautiful cathedrals, because America allowed for the church to be vibrant and grow in a way that being locked to a building doesn't allow. And so America, the idea that it's somehow been destructive to Christianity, it's sort of like the things we were saying about Putin earlier. They don't have kids in Russia, but they're pro-family. They're not Christians, but they're the great saviors of the faith. It's similar here. Like, you're saying that America has somehow been antithetical to Christianity. It's the only place where there are any Christians left. Health. America, according to Tucker, should be healthy. And it's not just Maha, obviously. It's that we should be able to grow food that's healthy. It's that we should be able to get off of all of these prescription drugs that we're on. What's our answer to this part of Tucker's remarks?
Well, I was struck by how confidently he speaks about every conceivable thing. It's just remarkable how there's just no nuance there, no room for doubting. But personally, the rhetoric that he was espousing about psychiatry and that type of thing, I mean, that sounded similar to his Scientologist friend, who is connected to the Russian government at senior levels and is very, very open about it. Also connected to the Chinese government, does a lot of business there as well. But the individual I'm referring to, based in London, John Mappin, who is very open about how close he claims that Charlie Kirk was a secret Scientologist. But there are other Scientologists
And
connected to
a
that.
huge defender of Candace.
And Charlie Kirk's ghost regularly talks to him to this day.
Yes, and he probably commissioned this very narcissistic biography about himself. It's authored by someone else, but it's all his words. And on the back of the book, he has blurbs recommending it from Candace and Tucker. And Tucker was giving a speech maybe like a year ago or so, where he made this very odd comment about the government of Germany and of all the things to complain about in regards to how religion is treated there and different issues. He makes this very strange comment where he's like, Yeah, like he really doesn't like it how they treat the Church of Scientology in Germany.
Interesting.
Very peculiar and out of place.
He's right that we need to have, the maximum of healthy food. We also need enough food. Many of the choices that were made with regard to, say, pesticides and herbicides, or because having possibly, questionable effects from having glyphosate or whatever residues on your wheat. Those effects in trade-off are slightly better than having millions of people not having any bread to eat, right? And so, but yes, we should be trying to produce healthy food. Yes, we should. Like my wife and I have this kind of saying is that a good doctor is trying to get you off of your medication. It's like the end of the prescription. You need it? Okay, fine. When's the end of it? And I don't think he's wrong to bring that stuff up. But the question is, is he just trying to create, for me, the question is he just trying to create like Maha 2.0 so he can kind of scoop some of those people up into this new movement that he's doing. So it sounds like he's talking about the issues. And that community, by the way, is rife. You want to talk about a community full of the conspiracy theory mindset that Tucker taps into so strongly. That's like ground zero in American culture for conspiracy theory. Every bit of food is trying to kill you. Every medicine is trying to kill you. It's giant corporate interests trying to kill you. The stakes feel so high. And so this is a very fruitful recruiting ground is kind of what I saw with that. Although there are valid points in there, of course. On the other hand, he also said like maybe he said something kind of mystical, like the closer our form is to how we were made, the more, healthier, holier, whatever it is. And it's like, that was really weird. Like some people just have to take medication. Like it's not optional anymore. And that's something, to just kind of blanket demonize that is really frightening and scary. Like he's like, maybe people should just stop taking their medicine. Who knows if that, that's a conversation to have, because he suddenly realized he's like advising the stupidest thing in the world to put on camera.
Number 6, Tucker Carlson, very important to him that America be honest. Number 7, optimistic.
Yeah, right.
He said this country doesn't care about kids.
Listen to me or everyone's going to die. The country's going to break apart into pieces. I mean, he's the most pessimistic person on earth in a position of influence. And it's ironic that he complains about mental health treatment when if you really listen and believe the stuff he says, your mental health is going to decline. You're going to need more medication. I mean, he has a very apocalyptic, scary view of how things are. Nothing's just a small problem. No, nothing's just like, it is a problem, here's a way to fix it. It's always the end of the world if you don't listen to me about every conceivable problem and nothing productive and nothing like pragmatic. I've been actually trying to figure out, is that just an ideological thing, or is there some psychological thing going on there where every little thing that is an imperfection is viewed as proof of impending doom for everybody?
Yeah.
My favorite was how he basically waxed poetic about all of the real and demographic facts of basically the Israeli national circumstance, with favoring children everywhere, people wanting to have great big families that are religiously grounded and firmly bound, and they have a great sense of national pride. Like he's basically describing, the fact is that the thing that a lot of these people are looking for in his audience is the Israeli circumstance, but it's supposed to be, Israel bad, so we can't do that. So then he takes this and projects it out into the rest of the world. One might presume Russia, which has an abominable birth rate, China, which has a literal catastrophic birth rate, and we can even pick more friendly countries like Japan. South Korea is on the edge of friendly, but South Korea, really abominable birth rates. The countries that actually have the crazy high birth rates that he's pointing to are almost exclusively, when not Israel, third world countries.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure exactly what he's trying to do, but the facts of the birth rate decline, it's not a family values decline. America's filled with them, except on the left where it's a bit twisted. But the birth rate decline in modern and developed societies is not actually clear. I have a very strong suspicion that distraction and being just busy, not that you've been told be the girl boss necessarily, just the feminist angle, which is consequential, but like you're just busy all the time. You've got stuff to do, and to set the time aside, even to pay proper attention to your spouse, can be hard.
Yeah. He caught himself because he did say you don't have to be an Orthodox Jew in order to have babies. Also, it was in one of the earlier ones, but he couldn't help but get a dig in, a Ben Shapiro dig in.
Oh yeah, it was Ben Shapiro's parents were the ones cooking up the banking schemes or something like that.
I mean, could you say a more anti-Semitic sentence than Ben Shapiro's parents were cooking up the banking schemes? Like it's unbelievable.
Yeah, I think I said out loud that one's getting clipped.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Number 9, Americans should be decent.
I mean, what do you even say to that? I'm trying to remember what examples he gave of decency as something that we should emulate. Do you guys remember? I remember him saying decency, but I'll remember him expanding and saying we need less of this or more of that.
Yeah, I remember. Surface, there's nothing to argue with. It's just, what do you mean by decent?
Yeah, I said out loud, actually, they're pacing in the back of the room with my teeth gritted. I said, I actually said these exact words. This is Lenin's second dialectic. And I was like cursing under my breath. So the Lenin had 3 dialectics. So the dialectical materialism, right, has 3 primary dialectics. The second one was what's called quantity transforms into quality, and quality transforms back into quantity. So the idea would be, when we enter socialism, when you're in capitalism or even feudalism, you have quantity, you have lots of stuff, right? And that's what he talked about. We have all this stuff, but we don't have decency. We're not proud. We can't be proud of who we are. So what happens is, with socialism, the idea was that, well, you'll have a whole lot less stuff, but it'll be socialist stuff, so it'll be good. You can feel good about it because it's for the community. So it's quantity is transformed into
crap.
Yeah. And so it's transformed into quality because it has like sentimental ties, and it's something you can be proud of as a people, etc. Well, this is like I said, this is the second dialectic of Lenin. So he got that from the communism.
Dugin's views on property.
Yeah.
What's he said? What does Dugin say?
That it's a communal property. There'll be less individualism because individualism is selfish and it's anti-spiritual. So you have to have a caring society where people share property. You do it for the purpose of the greater good in the community and not for yourself, and that there will be a substantial amount of state intervention in the means of production and property ownership.
Yeah, it was Tucker was maybe we'll have a bit less the dollar store crap, but we'll be better people. The problem is that socialists have never figured out how to do the second part of the dialectic. They literally destroyed millions of people trying to like the Great Leap Forward, trying to figure out how to turn this new socialist quality back into quantity, which is called having enough, and and to prove to the world that they have enough. And this has killed literally over 100 million people. So Dugin's not going to make it work. This idea that if we contract, stuff, if we contract GDP, I don't think he cursed GDP here, but he cursed GDP throughout. And this kind of whole post-liberal common good, GDP is not the ultimate measure of a society. If we think about contracting that so that we have more of what matters, this is what the degrowth communist movement says too, is that, real abundance is having less stuff so we can have like more nature and more leisure time because we're not spending as much time working. So we're really richer and have more abundance and more wealth if you redefine those things by having barely enough or not enough. Tucker didn't say we should have not enough, but he did have this idea of contracting our material wealth so that we can be, proud of how we're a decent people to one another. And I slightly suspect, he didn't say it to my recollection, but the movement he swims in is very interested in enforcing public morality. So if nothing else, that's this kind of a fortune cookie being thrown to them. That the reason we're not succeeding in John Adams's phrasing is we're not a moral and religious people anymore. So some enforcement of public morality and the instruction in morality, maybe through Christian means or whatever, is going to be necessary to get us how we are. That decency, that's an open door to that movement in the same way that, kind of the weird, nationalist project that, NatCon, National Conservatism represents, turned out to be, whatever you think of NatCon on the front door, it definitely had a back door that I don't even think the organizers expected, that it was going to get flooded with weirdos, white nationalists and anti-Semites, and even the Jewish head of this thing, Yoram Hazony, can't figure out how all these like Wignat nationalists got inside his nationalist project.
United. Number 10, America should be united.
That's where he talked about needing to create, meaning he has the idea for, a new American identity.
Yeah.
And this was after he was complaining about how we hold on to things like our founding documents for too long. Like he's saying, basically, we need to scrap all that. But it reminded me of his long podcast with Elizabeth Lane, because there were two parts that I really need to clip together, because she mentions Finland, and he goes, "Oh, I'm Finnish. They're the best people in the world. They're the smartest," and goes on and on. They're the wisest. I think he actually used that word. And then he goes, "and very white." And then later on, he goes, they bring up Finland again, and he goes, "Yeah, but I'm pessimistic about where Finland's going to go. It's becoming awfully African." Now, if you want to sanitize that, you can say he's talking about illegal immigration or whatever, but I mean, the word usage, and you pair that together with everything else, especially when tonight's statement, you notice how with almost every single thing he said, even if it was decency or whatever, at some point with almost every single one, he would say, "They'll call you a Nazi for saying this. They'll call you a white supremacist for saying this." Like it was, to me, really an attempt to redefine what those words mean and equate them with these things that nobody could possibly oppose, so that people rethink what that means.
Yeah, I mean, this is what Rosenberg referred to the Catholic Church as, was I finally remembered the wording. It was the Roman Syrian African Church. There's always a Syrian African, hyphenated, was the descriptor of the real roots of the Catholic Church, which is of course foreign to Europe. So when he says, that kind of language, whether there's projection involved or not, I don't know. But to just, like, as you say from the podcast, where he's just outright, it's becoming very African. I was like, that sounds just like, I mean, I'm not saying he's a Nazi, but it's the way they wrote, because they had no filter on that. Just like how Mussolini proudly wrote in The Doctrine of Fascism. Fascism is in every sense totalitarian, because like, nobody had the slightest idea there's a bad word at the time.
You guys know about Darryl Cooper's quote from when he was like anonymous on that message board. Darryl Cooper being his favorite historian, for those that don't know, that came on and said, "Oh, Churchill was actually the villain of World War II." And then Tucker and other people were saying, "Well, he's not really a Nazi or a white supremacist for saying that," And then later it comes out that Darryl Cooper actually wrote in a Nazi-associated white nationalist message board under another name that was discovered, that his plan was, over in the coming years, to basically advance the language of white supremacy and neo-Nazism, where he actually, just like stealth jihad with the Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood, same type of thing, where he said, well, you can't just expect people to just read Mein Kampf and buy it. You've got to kind of like slowly bring it into the discourse. And he described what to do. And then you cut from that to his first appearance on Tucker's show, and it's an astonishing fulfillment.
Yeah. And his second appearance this week on Tucker's show.
I can't believe you had him back. Yeah. Even if Tucker agrees with him or whatever, it's just, that was so risky. He must really feel untouchable and dedicated to Darryl Cooper's agenda, because he knows it now.
Yep.
He's not tricked
once
now.
again called him the most important historian, I think,
Again.
in the country. And of course had the Russian, perhaps Russian intelligence operative Elizabeth Lane on the show.
Oh, I forgot to
Comment
mention,
on
by the
word
way.
we skipped, which was wise. That's the whole comment on wise.
Yeah.
None of this is wisdomous.
Right. That's right. Well,
It's also a favorite word of his, wise. He really likes things that he likes, he calls wise. But to have it as a top 10 is kind of odd. There's one last thought about unity. And unity is a great thing to have, but of course, we're more polarized than ever, and it's not going to get better soon. But when he said we have to have a new identity as Americans, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
We need to regain our old American traditions and our founding American identity. And he didn't talk about that.
well, no, he's part of a movement that actually dislikes the founding vision of the country. The war against America as a proposition nation. I can understand people who believe that the proposition nation concept was hijacked, that it was used as a Trojan horse to bring in a kind of global, liberal, anti-national mondialism. And of course, America is not only a proposition, but the proposition is what allowed us to have unity. Tucker said, otherwise, he didn't use the word balkanized, but he said, We're not even going to have an interstate highway system. There's no reason why you wouldn't need a visa to go from one state to another. If we can't find unity, we won't remain unified, is the point that he was making. But the reason that you have a continent the size of Europe, that instead of having dozens of countries at war with each other for thousands of years, America has had one nation, one indivisible except for that one-time nation on this continent, that we all do largely speak the language that Tucker wants us to speak, which is English, that Dutch immigrants to the Pacific Northwest and Spanish immigrants to the Atlantic Southeast have become one people is the proposition. The proposition is the only thing that unified this continent. The idea that we're all created equal with certain unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and property, and broadly speaking, market capitalism, and broadly speaking, the Christian, and not just Christian, but Protestant Christian ethic, and particularly work ethic. Those are the unifying constructs. You didn't have to be any one of those things. You could be a Catholic in Maryland, and you could be, as I say, you could be Spanish in Florida, or you could be Mexican in Texas, of Mexican extraction in Texas, and yet still be an American only because of those ideas. And those aren't new ideas that are ahead of us. They're the old ideas. The answer to every one of the 10 things that Tucker proposed tonight he's right, these are our inheritance. But they're an inheritance that was bequeathed to us by people who embraced a proposition that Tucker now rejects. Tucker is saying that you can have the American inheritance apart from the American system. I'm not implying that he's saying that. He very explicitly said it tonight. The old system is old. The old system has failed. We need a new system.
Do you know, by the way, Jeremy, what the precursor organization that became the Democratic Socialists of America was called?
No.
It was not the Democratic Socialists of America all the way back. It was, it comes out of the Students for Democratic Society. And in the interim period, it actually there's two parallel organizations. It's a little messy politically, but it was called the New America Movement.
Yeah.
And that became the DSA at some point, some decades ago.
We don't need a new America movement. We don't need a new political party premised on left-wing economics and right-wing social policy. We need, I hate to say it, the good old USA. We need the ideals of the Declaration as ensconced in the systems of the Constitution. We need the civic virtue that we have lost. We need a reconstruction of the institutions, which after COVID did fail us. They'd been failing us for years, have been corrupted. And in 2020, they revealed themselves to be very corrupt. And the answer is a restoration of them. And the power to restore them is in the hands of every single one of us. It's not national change. It's not some great podcaster is going to launch a new political party and maybe run for president. Your hope is not outside. Your hope is in your actions. Go do something about it. Every one of us can do something about it. If we do, we can keep the country. If we don't, the Tucker path is not going to lead us to a restoration of American virtue. It's going to lead to the very thing that he claims we're going to get if we don't follow him, which is national divorce, national ruin, national collapse, national violence. Those are our future. Ironically, if we continue to listen to the politics of despair and long for some sort of revolutionary future, instead of just doing what Americans have been doing for 250 years, which is being American. Thank you guys for hanging out tonight. Thanks for sitting through that with me and for analyzing it. And look forward to talking to you again soon.